Summer with the Doctor. Blue Bay Beach reads romance series. Book 6. By Ellie Hall. Copyright 2020 Ellie Hall. All rights reserved. Chapter 1. Cleo. After making a big, life-changing decision, Cleo Jane Carson expected dread to pool in her belly, causing her limbs to go numb and making her knees feel weak. Wearing what could only be described as a confection of a wedding gown, she wasn't experiencing that at all as she walked along the sandy street in a town she'd never visited before. Blue Bay something or other. She only vaguely registered the sign on the edge of town when she'd passed. Instead of dismay and anxiety, she was feeling relief. Like she'd dodged a bullet. No, she'd evaded a missile. A digital video game missile, but one all the same. It would devastate most women to be left at the altar. Although technically, she was the one who'd fled. She'd have to deal with the fallout with her family on that score later. For now, she felt free. Cleo lifted her arms in the air, feeling the strain on the lace sleeves of her custom-made gown. Sparkling stones encrusted the fabric. They glinted in the sun. She looked gorgeous, but sweat pooled everywhere she didn't want it to. The gown had a V-neck and ruffles at the seat, giving way to a long train. It was a work of art. A sweat-inducing work of art. She hooped at the sea, the seagulls, and the open air. Heavenly Father, thank you for helping me out back there. For giving me the strength to walk away, she added. I don't know what on earth I was thinking. Brian Baker, her fiancé, was a video game junkie. He lived and breathed epic battles on the screen. He worked in the industry and had to test out the merchandise, as he'd said. It made sense in a way. It would be hypocritical for him to sell games and not have any first-hand knowledge of what he was talking about. However, he'd also said that he was in the best industry in the world because vids sold themselves. Oh, he was a Class A hypocrite all right. When he wasn't working, he played them morning, noon, and night. However, she'd been to his office a few times, and he often had a controller in hand there too. When she'd stop by his apartment, he'd have his headset on, and the reflection of explosions and gunfire would shine in his eyeglasses. On paper, he looked great. A high-level executive at a booming gaming company. A pedigree family who would pass down their wealth to him. He'd been a trust fund kid but went to college and got a job. In Cleo's opinion, he didn't work all that hard. Mostly, he seemed to play. He didn't make any meaningful difference in the world. But she tried to look past all of that. She wanted to get married and have a family more than anything. She thought she wanted to be Mrs. Baker, but she now saw it would only result in hurt and humiliation. As awful as the last hour of her life had been, she could already see it was for the best. Or maybe it hadn't quite sunk in yet because her mother would be outraged. Not that Winona Carson liked Brian much. No, she liked his bank account. That wasn't why Cleo wanted to get married. She wanted to share delicious dinners and engaging conversation. Long strolls on the beach. To travel and see the world through each other's eyes. To help those less fortunate. To have a family. As she hiked up the full skirt of her gown and plodded down the road, she still felt the glee of escaping what would have been a terrible marriage, but she wasn't sure where she was going. Maybe that was the point. On one side of the road, mansion homes surrounded by gates and greenery reminded her of where she'd come from. On the other side, the ocean stretched broad and endless. A sailboat bobbed in the distance, and a seabird dove into the placid water. A dusty sedan pulled up alongside her. Excuse me, miss. Do you need a ride? She'd grown up in South Carolina and had moved to New York when she'd started high school. But she never forgot her manners. Nor did she forget her city smarts. It was an older couple. He was bald. She had poodle-like white hair. They seemed friendly enough. Even if she took them up on the offer, she didn't have a destination in mind. When she didn't answer right away, the woman leaned over the center console and asked, "Miss, is there anything you need?" Yes. She needed a husband. A family. The clock was ticking. Cleo pulled her mind from the ditches of her most frequent thought to address the matter at hand. She gestured to her wedding dress. "Oh, you mean because of this? As you can see, I am not getting married today. I will not be taking the last name, Baker, either. I thought I wanted to, but see now that was a foolish decision." She huffed. "I think I'll walk this off, but thank you very much for your concern." She nodded to let them know she was indeed okay. The words she'd blurted to the kind older couple sounded slightly unhinged. "If you change your mind, we live nearby. Just take a right near the fire station. If you reach Coco's Cones, you've gone too far." "That's mighty kind of you. I appreciate it." They hesitated but then pulled slowly away. Cleo carried on and reached the fire station as the kindly couple had mentioned. However, she continued to walk right past Coco's Cones, Beach Wave Salon, and then Blonde and Blue Boutique. All the while, passers-by stared at her. No surprise, considering her attire. If she had her wallet, she'd have purchased a change of clothes. Despite the cost of the dress, she wasn't one to stand out. But it had been her wedding day and her mother had insisted on over the top, which was normal for Winona. A woman walking a labradoodle approached on the sidewalk. "Are you okay, miss?" she asked when she was closer. Cleo thumbed behind her. "He left me at the altar. I left my wedding." She heard how that sounded. "Just taking a walk. You know." "Yep." She sounded like she was a sheet short a layer cake. She gently placed her hand on the woman's forearm. "Thank you for asking. If you need anything, I live just up that way. Sandpiper Lane." Cleo nodded her thanks and carried on. As she approached the church, the pastor was waving goodbye to a father and his daughter. Cleo felt the clergyman's gaze fall on her. He strode down the path in front of the church and lifted his hand for her attention. "Miss, can I help you?" His face was serene and without judgment. In fact, everyone she'd met so far had been especially kind. She nodded slowly. "Yes. Probably, but I'll have to get back to you." She winced. "Then I won't press, but you know where to find me." He pointed over his shoulder toward the church. Cleo thanked him and then carried on, passing a souvenir shop and Auntie M's candies. The town was beachy and welcoming with its tree-lined sidewalks, decorated shop windows, and classic small-town vibe. On her right was a grand bed and breakfast and on her left, a beach rentals shop. It seemed like a wonderful place to visit or settle down. She crossed to the boardwalk and the beach. Couples, families, and groups of friends gathered, sunbathed, and picnicked. Sandcastles were being built, seagulls wheeled in the sky, people were laughing and splashing in the water. It was the picture-perfect scene on a perfect summer day. A little girl wearing a polka-dot bathing suit rushed up to her, calling, "Mommy, Mommy, look, a princess." Her face lit up. Cleo, already scorching, felt her cheeks heat. How could she possibly explain? How could she possibly ever have a little girl or boy or 2 or 10 of her own? She'd always wanted a big family. The chaos, the love, and the excitement of it thrilled her, filled her, and made her wake up each day hopeful. As far as she could tell, that lifelong desire was not to be. Turning in the sand, she had to get away from there. away from the stark reality that her dreams were not going to come true. As she rushed back to the quiet beach by the mansions where she'd hooped at the ocean, the last hours of her life chased her then caught up. The hour before she and Brian were to get married, they were standing on opposite sides of a door, the whole don't see the bride in the gown tradition. Brian was talking to his friends. She had the stupid idea that she'd hear him confess his excitement for their nuptials. Her sisters crowded behind her, listening. For the last year, the wedding and her future were the only things she could think or talk about. Brian let her handle everything. Naturally, her mother took the reins and helped, or more accurately, mother of the bridezilla Ed. Cleo wasn't a bridezilla, but her mother had become overly involved and demanding. Together with her sisters, they got her under control. But just before the ceremony, they were all giddy and excited as they listened in on the conversation among the guys. From the other side of the wall, Brian's phone rang. It wasn't his usual ringtone. It was a rap tune about big butts. Cleo had felt her stomach twist. She'd heard that particular tune come from his phone once or twice before but didn't think anything of it. Brian and his buddies had an overall immature sense of humor, but Cleo understood that marriage meant overlooking little things and focusing on the big stuff, the love they shared, the way they each contributed to the relationship, and how they lived out their values. His friends chuckled. From the little snippets she could overhear, Brian had met a girl online. Mandy. Username Mandalicious. As Cleo stood there, she caught snatches of the conversation among the guys. She was also a gamer. They'd hang out virtually and play video games together using headsets. They were dating on the sly. He was a cheater. Cleo didn't know to what extent, but Brian's behavior made a crushing kind of sense. The late nights at the office. The cancelled dinner dates. His long trips. The constant attachment to his phone. With the devastating recent memory, Cleo's pace slowed as she walked back the way she came along a street called Mansion Mile. The harsh reality caught up with her just then. Their wedding was a result of Cleo pressuring Brian. She dropped not-so-subtle hints about the future. She was getting older. Not that old, just in her early 30s, but still. All of her sisters and best friends were married and having kids. She wanted that. It was like each day she could see her window of opportunity closing inch by inch. Since she was a little girl, she'd always dreamed of a wedding and had a notebook with everything planned out, right to the last detail. Of course, her tastes had changed over the years, and her mother had taken over planning, meaning everything about the nuptials had gotten out of hand and was over the top. But the future she saw of herself involved a ring on her finger and kids tugging on her skirt. Her father had been a chief surgeon, and her mother was a society woman. They'd divorced during the move from NC to NYC, not that they were together much to begin with. She had a few good memories and both of them meant well, but they operated on a different wavelength than Cleo. They were all about prestige and wealth while she preferred faith and the simple things, not that she was a stranger to the finery her parents' lifestyle afforded her. Nor was she ungrateful or spoiled, she just wanted what she felt like she didn't have, a solid partnership and a relationship with her children that involved laughter, and not at someone else's expense. Cleo Jane Carson wanted her happily ever after. She didn't imagine it would happen anytime soon, if ever. Plodding through the sand and dropping to sitting, she rested her elbows on bent knees and propped her cheeks on her fists. The ocean was calm and blue and beautiful. A little voice entered her thoughts. What about happy right now? Ever after will come in time. She sat with the thought for moments that stretched long. The sun lowered degree by degree. Then the stark reality smashed like a wave against the rocks down the beach. How would she face them all again, her mother, her sisters, and her friends? What would she do? Winona mother was sure to be livid. Her father had probably rolled over in his grave. Then again, she never got the sense that he'd approved of Brian. William Carson just tolerated him, mostly. Not that he ever involved himself in Cleo's personal life. He got on well with Karen and Christie's husbands, her sisters, but she was the youngest and most often forgotten or dismissed. Cleo let out a long sigh. Movement up the beach caught her eye. A man was walking toward her. He was tall, fit, and had a distinguished look, not disheveled like Brian after playing video games all day, and not like he'd been sitting on the beach all day either. As he neared, a few gray hairs coming in at the temples glinted in the sunlight. His jaw was chiseled with a flattering amount of stubble. His electric blue eyes were unmistakable. Cleo's mouth dropped. Had she gone mad? Stress. Had she cracked? It couldn't be. The man was barefoot and only a few paces away. Dr. Caleb Robinson? She blinked a few times to be sure. He'd somehow improved with age, and he was already incredibly handsome when they'd known each other all those years ago. Not that she should have been thinking about that.
Chapter 2. Caleb. Caleb approached someone wearing ridiculous attire for an afternoon at the beach. Was it a child playing dress-up or someone who was a card short a deck? As he got closer, her profile, as she slumped in the sand, gazing at the sea, looked vaguely familiar. Her auburn hair was pulled half up and trailed down her back. Her veil blew in the light breeze. She had a creamy complexion, but as he neared, tears streaked down her face. It was a woman dressed as a bride. It was Cleo Carson. She got to her feet. They just stood there, facing each other. For years during low moments, he thought about what he'd say when they saw each other again. He'd explain. Apologize. Try to help her understand. It took him a long time to understand himself. Ultimately, he knew he'd made the right decision, but it had hurt just the same. There were no words. They studied each other. Was that really happening? She had deep olive green eyes surrounded by thick eyelashes and tasteful makeup. The cross she'd always worn looped around her neck and between the V-shaped plunge of her gown's neckline. Her features were perfect in every way, as though carved from marble, like a Greek statue, smooth and curved and voluptuous. She'd loved big and lived life to the fullest. She sniffed and wiped her eyes. There were no words, just stillness as the waves ebbed and flowed by their feet. It was as if they couldn't quite believe the other was real. Caleb couldn't name how he felt and suddenly had a new appreciation for patients who described their symptoms with vague words. A tingling. A humming. A vibration. It was under his skin and in his blood and his bones. He drew a ragged breath, finally finding words. I was sitting on the balcony of my rental house overlooking the Gulf, watching the shorebirds skittering across the sand as the waves receded. They'd been hunting and pecking on their long legs. I decided to take a walk. He trailed off because the walk led him back to her. How very pleasant of you. Her voice was as he remembered, with the faintest hint of a southern accent, but there was an edge to it. That, he should have expected. Meanwhile, I was trying to outrun a missile. What? He asked, confused. Never mind, she huffed and started walking away. He hurried after her. Considering the fact that she was on a beach wearing a wedding gown, something big must have just happened in her life. Seeing him right then probably wasn't ideal. Caleb reached for her arm, halting her. While I was minding my own business, taking a walk on the beach, it's as if the past has caught up to me literally. He was her past. They were each other's past. Would have had a future too had he not made the most difficult decision of his life. They'd met in the Dominican Republic one summer when he was a young doctor and she was a volunteer on a Christian mission trip. They'd had a fling. It wasn't something he was proud of, considering the circumstances. They'd also had a sizable age gap that felt too wide to bridge once they returned to reality. They met when she was 22 and he was 29. She was finishing college, and he was starting his career. That month, he'd be celebrating his big 40. Time had snuck up on him, that was for sure. If she'd been older or him younger, they'd probably have a half-dozen kids and be happily married. All along, he'd known she was the one, but apart from his trepidation about their age difference, there was another problem. One he couldn't bear to think about. Not while facing her. "Cleo, are you okay?" Genuine concern filled his voice. "You're not the first person to ask, and at last, I have an honest answer." "No, not really." "What can I do for you?" "Can I help?" Again, already been asked. "No, thank you. Don't want your help, anyway. You already did enough harm." He flinched. That was true. He had put him in an operating room, under pressure, where lives were at stake and he could perform. He knew what to do. He hadn't lost anyone in his history. Except that last one. Except for Cleo. Caleb swallowed thickly. "Do you want to talk about it?" He wasn't sure if he was referring to their past or what had brought her to the beach in a wedding gown. He supposed either would do. She dropped into the sand as if the weight of whatever troubled her had knocked her down. The skirt of her gown spilled in every direction. She leaned back and gazed at the sky. He was a surgeon, but his training in medicine urged him to evaluate if she was of sound mind. "I know what you're doing up there," she said as he gazed down at her. "I just want to make sure that you're okay." "Wow. That's rich. You probably should have checked in on me 10 years ago." "I deserve that." She grunted. "If it isn't obvious, today was my wedding day." He'd always assumed she'd marry young. How could a woman like her stay single for a decade? It baffled him. "I was staying at a luxury resort in the next town over. My mother picked it. Said it was lucky she was able to book the place because they'd hosted the 4th of July and were in demand. Leave it to my mother to want something that everyone else does." Her family was very wealthy. Meanwhile, he'd worked hard for every cent he had and put in extra hours, if only to pay off his medical school loans before he'd gotten married. It was supposed to be a magical day. 300 guests. The best of everything from food to music to flowers. My sisters and friends looked gorgeous in their champagne gowns. Cleo went on to tell him about Brian, her fiancé, who was obsessed with work, which Caleb could relate to. He couldn't fault the guy and had made his own mistakes in a marriage that ended in divorce. Then she told him about overhearing the ringtone and the guys joking about Mandylicious. "I'm sorry, Cleo." "Save it." "I'm not sorry. As I said, I dodged a missile. I don't know what I was thinking. He was all wrong for me and I would have ended up divorced just like my parents. I'm not judging people who do that, but all I've ever wanted was a family and now it's ruined. If I'm sorry about anything, it's that. So terribly, utterly, deeply sorry." Tears streamed down her face. He fought the urge to place a hand on her back to soothe her. Likely, it would be unwelcome. "If you'd like, I can bring you back to the resort. You can talk to him and get it sorted out. Maybe it was a misunderstanding." She turned to face him. Tears tracked through the makeup on her face, but she was still as beautiful as he remembered. Somehow more so. "I know what I heard, Caleb. I wasn't suggesting you were wrong, but maybe there's an explanation." She shook her head. The ringtone and the conversation in the hall wasn't all. "But what could I do?" "Exactly as you said, there had to be an explanation. I figured that we'd go through with the ceremony and talk later." However, that wasn't the worst of it. The live string quartet started playing the processional song. The bridal party marched out. Everything was perfect. Sunny day. He squinted his bright blue eyes as he glanced at the sparkling water, then back at her. Everyone showed up and had taken their places. No crises or fire that the wedding planner had to put out, logistically speaking. Although, at my sister's wedding, a few years ago, my Uncle Murray lit her veil on fire with his cigar. Thankfully, it was after the ceremony and she hadn't planned to wear it at the reception. Her new husband had to put out the flames. He loved listening to her talk with her hint of an accent, having grown up in South Carolina. He was originally from Australia. They were worlds apart, yet somehow returned to each other on that random beach. Though, maybe it wasn't so random. Sounds like a close call. Good thing she married a doctor. Caleb wished he could take back the words, but Cleo didn't seem to question why he'd know something like that. If asked, he could say that doctors knew doctors. It wasn't a lie, just an evasion of the entire truth. Back to what should have been my big day. My maid of honor, my best friend Kimmy, walked down the aisle with the best man. The music was about to change to the bridal march. It was in that pause that Brian's phone rang again. It was her. Mandylicious. The same ringtone. The rap about big butts. Cleo's nostrils flared. Caleb envisioned what happened next. She burned down the wedding, metaphorically speaking, with her fiery redhead anger. He imagined the wedding planner had multiple flames to extinguish. And do you know what that jerk said? Cleo asked. Anger radiated off her intense waves. Caleb shook his head slowly. Brian had the nerve to stop the ceremony and say, "I have to take this." Then I ran off and here I am. Caleb couldn't help it. The flat of his palm pressed against Cleo's back and he squeezed her shoulder. That's terrible. I'm so sorry. She shrugged him off. Like I said. I'm not. Her expression was open, plain. Then she started laughing. A big peal of laughter erupted from her. I don't know what's so funny about this, but I can't help myself. It's crazy. Insane. I can't deny that I'm disappointed. I always wanted to marry. That was my dream since I was a little girl. He knew that. Then, as though reading his thoughts, she added, too bad the guy whom I could stay up all night with talking about everything and nothing, who I thought was the one up and walked away. On to bigger and better ventures, I suppose. Not even so much as a proper goodbye. I get it now, though. I'm not worth marrying. No one wants me. And now I'm rambling and sobbing. I'm a mess, Caleb. Why don't you go on back to your mansion or whatever and carry on with your life? Make sure your wife knows you love and treasure her. It was nice seeing you. She was crying and stumbled as she tried to get up. Caleb reached for her. Wait, please. She sat back down. He sifted the sand through his hands, wondering what to address first. Number 1, I'd like to talk to you about what happened in the DR. Number 2, you are worth marrying. You are wanted. I can't imagine what was going through Brian's mind, but he screwed up bad. He has to see that. And your rambling and sobbing is understandable, all things considered. But I don't think that you're a mess and I'm not going anyway. She was quiet, a rarity for Cleo Carson if she was still anything like she'd been during that summer on the island. Oh, and I'm not married, Caleb added. The nuptials with Vivian von Kleberg had been in the society papers, so it would be no surprise Cleo would know, and if not that, surely her mother would have had something to say about it. Vivian was New York City elite. The granddaughter of a shipping magnate. The daughter of a financier. There was nothing money couldn't buy. Nothing except his attention. He wasn't able to give her enough. Sure, the Brian guy sounded like a real piece of work, but Cleo had to have seen the writing on the wall during the duration of their dating and engagement. I didn't realize you guys split up. I'm sorry, she said. Same as you. Don't be. No love was lost. It was more of a marriage of convenience. It made sense. Or, if you were to ask Vivian, it made sense. She knew she was marrying New York City's premier cardiac surgeon and what that meant, but even that awareness didn't change things. It wasn't enough. I heard they ranked you among the top 3 surgeons in the world. Congrats on that, by the way. A person doesn't achieve that by spending weekends at the country club and jet-setting all over the place like Vivian pressured me to do. I understood that she wanted more time with me, or perhaps it was the idea of me. The prestige. The accolades. Nothing made her happy. When I did break away and we were able to spend time together, we'd fight. Now, I'm rambling. Sorry. There were so many sorries that he wanted to say but couldn't. While Vivian may have realized what she was getting into, Brian wasn't exactly in the business of saving lives. He sold video games. Granted, he was at the executive level, but still. No doubt they take skill to create and play. I'm not undermining that, but the guy was obsessed. It was all he talked about. I blame myself for not seeing the writing on the wall. He hardly heard what else she said beyond the comment about saving lives. That was the thing. He didn't. At least not any longer. He'd failed. There was a certain expectation in that elite world that he attend charity events, but to stay at the top and save lives he had to remain at the top of his game. That meant constant study, learning, and innovation. But he'd fallen. He'd fallen hard from grace. However, that was something he could never, not ever, tell Cleo. He'd once dreamed of seeing her in a gown. But not so upset. Not with tears staining her cheeks. Caleb thought he'd had it all. He'd lost it. Now, he had nothing. He could fake it. Make it look like he was still on top of the world. But inside he was crushed. Ruined. Torn in pieces. He wondered if he'd ever be whole again. Wonder if Cleo saw the brokenness in him. He didn't want her to. He put on his classic smile, flashing his pearly whites, and hid his pain from her just as he did the rest of the world.
Chapter 3. Cleo. Cleo could not believe she was sitting next to Caleb Robinson on the beach. She couldn't believe she'd told him the single most humiliating thing that had ever happened in her life. She could not believe that she still felt attracted to him. If she could, she'd toss the notion in the ocean and let it wash away, then sink to the depths. But she couldn't ignore the way he looked at her, like he was listening intently. Like she was the only girl in the world. Like her story mattered. The thing was, he'd proved that none of that was true. She couldn't ignore the way his smile invited her gaze, to wonder if his lips on hers would still feel the same. They'd kissed plenty the summer that she still tried so hard to forget. She couldn't ignore the rush of his hand on her back as he tried to be comforting. The way it zoomed excitedly through her system like it was her wedding day. Well, it was her wedding day, but that had been one big fail. Now, it was her not wedding day. From the hidden folds of Cleo's dress came the chime of her sister's favorite Brad Paisley song. My sister insisted a pocket be sewn into my gown. That's my phone. That's her calling. I assumed so. At least it's not the rap song about butts. Caleb's Australian accent wrapped around the words. Cleo almost, but not quite, cracked a smile at his voice and not the comment, though if it were different circumstances it would have been funny. To keep it from her lips she said, Christy is clever like that. She says all dresses should have pockets. She even started a design company herself and sells dresses and skirts with pockets on Etsy. As you can imagine, my mother was less than thrilled, but the enterprise got her a deal with Bloomingdale's, so that's something. The phone continued to ring. In case you're wondering, I'm not answering it on purpose. I don't want them to worry, but I'm not ready to deal with all of it. And there would be a lot of explaining and crying and negotiating with her mother. Not for the emotional reasons associated with being left at the altar, but her mother would be sure to guilt Cleo about her humiliation in front of all her friends and associates. It wasn't that her mother was cold or heartless, she just had different priorities. What did your sisters think of Brian? Caleb asked. Cleo grunted. Then the question itself made her pause, and not because she hadn't thought of it before. Rather, it was the fact that he'd asked. Back in the DR, the only thing she'd missed was her sisters, and New York City bagels. They were cautious. She stopped herself. Do you want to tell me what happened 10 years ago? Cleo was not the kind of girl to hold back. She had Southern manners and New York boldness. Karen said she was too quick to profess her feelings. Christy said she wore her heart on her sleeve. Caleb's knees were bent and his inner elbow rested loosely on his thighs. His feet were in the sand and he gazed out to sea. Time had done him well. She bit her lip. After that summer fling, she'd deduced that he was afraid that he was too old for her. He'd once said that she still had so much to live, so many guys to date before she settled down. He didn't want to hamper her or have her look back and regret being with him. Instead, all she did was pine after him in all the years since and measure every guy against him. She must have misplaced her yardstick when it came to Brian. Caleb said, "Do you want to finish telling me about what happened today? Get it out of the way before we open that time capsule." While she could talk in circles and loops and come back around to her point, he was always so orderly and methodical. There was merit in it. She knew that. Perhaps he was right. Best to get everything with Brian off her chest and then they could discuss the past. The thing was, as much as she resented Caleb for what had happened, he'd always been so easy to talk to. He was a great listener. Always had insight. She took the risk, knowing full well that it might hurt on the other end. For now, she'd start at the beginning. A year and a half ago, Brian and I met on a dating website. Christy met her soulmate there, so I thought I'd give it a shot. The first red flag should have been the words gamer guy GLHF. Gamer guy I get, but what's GLHF? It's gamer slang. An acronym for good luck, have fun. If it wasn't obvious then, it should have been clear when the second red flag waved wildly. On our first date, he didn't eat all of his pizza. He didn't even take a doggy bag. Maybe he didn't want to eat the leftovers, Caleb said. She shook her head. Do you really want me to get into food waste in this country? We could feed all the hungry people in the world plus. One of her passions was creating sustainable practices for people, including zero waste whether it had to do with food, clothing, or anything else for that matter. Winona said it was her grandmother's influence who'd grown up during the Depression, not that Winona had any trouble living large. Yes, she saw the irony as she sat in her sand-covered wedding gown that was now wet along the hem from a rogue wave. Third red flag, Brian didn't want kids. I thought it was a soft no. Like, we're not married yet so no, I don't want kids right now, but in a year or so. Something like that. Nope. It was a hard no. He didn't want kids ever. He probably worried they'd fight for time with the video game console. Her laugh was sour. It felt good to say it all, but questions and doubts about herself crowded her mind. Why had her judgment been so skewed? What was she thinking? Was she desperate? Was something wrong with her? Cleo let out a long exhale. Now, I'm the one over here adrift in a ditch waving a red SOS flag. You can't be adrift and in a ditch at the same time, Caleb said smartly. Well, duh. But that's how it feels. Yeah. I get that, Caleb said. The sincerity in her tone and the fact that he didn't correct her suggested he did. Probably had to do with his divorce. I'm sorry if this brings up a sore subject for you. He brushed the sand from his hands. Nope. Not sore at all. You may have dodged the missile, but it hit me full on. She screwed up her lips, trying to offer him an expression of understanding. After a pause, giving him the chance to talk about it, she said, was it that bad? If you ever want to talk about it. Nah. I'm good. While she was the one who openly communicated her feelings and desires, he'd always been reluctant, slow to open up. Thanks for listening to me. Brian paid more attention to his fantasy football league players and his video games than the real, live people in front of him. I could keep going with my list of red flags. This all might make me sound like high maintenance, but I'm serious. He was glued to his screens from the moment he got out of work. While we were on a date out, he'd check his stats every 10 seconds. Date nights consisted of a running commentary on his latest post-apocalyptic shooting games. As she spoke it all aloud, it was shocking they'd dated at all, no less engaged to marry. Caleb inclined his head. Why did you bother with him to begin with? You'd once been madly in love with me and we sound like two very different types of men. Correction. Your former fiancé sounds like a boy. Apparently, he'd changed. Then again, perhaps Cleo had changed as well. He waved his hand slightly. I'm sorry. That was blunt. I didn't mean to overstep. No, it isn't any of your business, but time was marching on and I was still single. Before he could argue with her, she said, age is not just a number, Caleb. I had countless dating failures. My mother set me up with a lot of eligible bachelors. All so fussy. Preoccupied with money. They didn't get it. Didn't get me. That was something I always respected about you, Cleo. You understand that money isn't everything and it'll never fill the emptiness a person feels inside. Nope. Only God can do that. Amen. Her mother had many great qualities, but like her suitors, she was preoccupied with net worth. Speaking of feeling empty inside, my mother thought they were all great. My father would have just wanted me to be happy, but he passed away earlier this year. He'd met Brian only a few times. I was so focused on getting married I didn't think about if we were truly compatible in the long term. Because of my father's death, I also should have called off the wedding, but looking back I was being selfish. Caleb shifted as though the subject was uncomfortable. I'm sorry about your father. Me too. It's not selfish to want to have love and be happy. I'm sure he would have wanted that for you. Caleb's voice nearly cracked. Perhaps he'd recently lost someone as well. Thanks. Anyway, my friends and sisters said I should try branching out. Maybe my pool of options was too small. Too similar. There were 3 Esquires and 3 thirds. As in Harold Hopsworth III. He chuckled lightly. Sounds boring. So you decided to mix it up. I guess it was a way to rebel. Brian was a way to show them that I was in charge of my future. Truth is, I was just tired of dating. Do you know how tedious it is to repeat the autobiography spiel on the first date? Hi, my name is Cleo and I'm blah, blah, blah. I created a scale to gauge the likelihood that there would be a second date. Punctuality, manners, did he hold the door open, is he polite to the waiter, and so on. Sounds like an analytical approach, assessing each date on a scale. Amusement played on Caleb's lips. Sounds exhausting if I'm honest and takes the spark right out of it. Oh, and I forgot. Does he check his phone? Brian failed that right out of the gate, but by then I was fatigued. I can see that. Seems like there was a lot of pressure there too. I was the only one pressuring myself. Big of you to admit that. Everyone gently suggested that I was being too particular when it came to men. But a woman has to have standards. Don't you think? His electric blue eyes flicked to hers. Of course. But it seems to me like you're a woman who knows what she wants. She clapped her hands together. Finally, someone sees reason. I speak with conviction because I'd settled. Sure, I loved my wife in a way, but she didn't inspire me. Her life consisted of social events and shopping. It makes her sound shallow and vain. But she was beautiful. Is beautiful, Cleo corrected, stumbling over the words and not entirely comfortable talking about the illustrious Vivian von Kleberg. She'd encountered the heiress once. She was the kind to look down her perfect nose and flip her perfect hair and smile condescendingly with her perfect smile. Beauty isn't everything, Caleb said. Cleo didn't want to bad-mouth or think poorly of the woman, but she'd be a liar if she didn't acknowledge that talking about Caleb's ex was uncomfortable. She knew she was marrying a doctor. She knew I had aspirations, wanted to help people, and would be gone frequently. Instead of enjoying the time we did have together, she complained. Instead of finding her passion in life, she gave me an ultimatum. Scale back my practice or divorce. He winced. You chose your career. Caleb nodded. I can't pretend to be anything other than who I am. Then he mumbled, though I'm not sure who that is anymore. She wanted to pull that thread, but resisted. Being a gossip or nosy wasn't good manners. So if the choice is dodging the missile or being hit by the missile, it seems you did right by running. He shook his head. That came out wrong. You could have talked it out, but you know what I mean. What I don't understand is why Brian would do that. Then again, I guess he is who he is. I should have known going in. She echoed Caleb's comments. I think you should be asking why would an idiot like that leave a woman like you? You're intelligent, beautiful, and have a mission-driven heart. You'd help anyone in the world. In fact, you have. Heat rose to her cheeks. If I could, I'd help everyone in the world. She went silent and then laughed through her nose. Look at us, just sitting here chatting as if 10 years hadn't passed. 10 long years, he added. I don't even want to think about it, she said, referring to what had transpired between them. She'd left those memories in luggage that she never wanted to unpack. You have to, Cleo. You were always so practical. I'm afraid I haven't changed much. With the sun lowering but still overhead and the content of the conversation, Cleo was overheating. She needed to cool off. The dress, along with the day, was already ruined, so what did it matter? We'll see about that. Cleo leaped to her feet, hiked up her dress, took his hand in hers, and started for the water.
Chapter 4. Caleb. No, Caleb hadn't changed yet, but he felt it coming on the breeze. He wasn't sure what he was in for, but if medicine had been his bride, he'd recently divorced. In fact, his ex-wife accused him of being married to medicine. It wasn't just that he was a doctor. It was his calling. To heal, cure, and prevent. To give people hope. A second chance. That was his mission. He rushed after Cleo as she raced toward the water. Her hand in his electrified him. She was serious when necessary but also had a playful side that had always surprised him. It wasn't that she was immature, but somehow she knew that he could stand to be less somber. As much as she could, she lifted the dress fabric out of the way of the gentle waves. He moved to pick it up. Don't bother, she said as she splashed a little, getting her ankles wet. Her skin under the gown was summer tan and glowing, just as it had been when they'd had their summer fling. The memories of them sneaking out at night to go swimming in the Dominican Republic brought a smile to his face. Don't bother with the train. It's a wreck. Get it? Train wreck. She stomped back and forth in the shallows, singing the wedding march under her breath. My wedding was a train wreck. Instead of having a spread in one of the bridal magazines for how to plan a perfect wedding, my mother secured an editorial. Instead, they'll title it How Not to Have a Disaster of a Wedding. My failed day will be a prime example. Cleo was on an emotional roll. She'd moved from sad to hysterical to angry. He couldn't blame her. Caleb rolled up the hem of his linen trousers and waded in. Oh, come on. Don't be afraid. It's just salt water. When he didn't move, she added, it's just me. That's exactly what he was afraid of. Instead of trying to coax him, she looped her arm through his and said, this is how I wished it would have gone. A small intimate ceremony on the beach. The pastor unites us in the sacred vows of marriage. Maybe we light a unity candle. Something simple, meaningful, beautiful. Cleo kicked at the water, sending a spray toward the glowing sun. The water droplets sparkled like the gems on her gown. He couldn't help but focus on her use of the words us and we. Did she mean her and Brian, them, or was she using the general form of the pronoun? The idea that there ever could be a them again wasn't something he wanted to risk entertaining. As he'd said, he couldn't pretend to be anything other than who he was. He was a surgeon. He'd ruined one marriage. Why waste another? Not that Cleo would even be interested in him. Then a dark thought surfaced. Even if she was, it could never be. She'd never forgiven him for what he'd done. She wouldn't forgive him for what she didn't know he did. All at once, Cleo went still. She gazed at the sun as it dipped lower. Sunset was still hours away, but it no longer beamed overhead. Her eyes shone in the honeyed light. In the weeks he'd been staying in the mansion on the edge of Blue Bay Beach, he'd relished the time when the sun dropped below the horizon. When he could put another day behind him. "What are you doing here?" Cleo's voice came to him clear as though so much time hadn't elapsed since their last meeting. He felt her eyes on him, burning like the orb in the sky. That was a question he simply couldn't answer in full. I'm here to help you. What do you need? How can I help? You were always right there, eager to pitch in. It's my way. Can I get you a change of clothes? A ride somewhere? She glanced down at the gown that drifted in the water like a jellyfish. It was custom made. Cost a fortune. Despite my zero waste, reduce, reuse, recycle inclinations, this is a single-use only article of clothing. I may as well get my money's worth. Unlike his family, Cleo's was wealthy, but he knew that she'd seen enough of the poverty and struggles in the world not to take it for granted and was as charitable as possible. She'd shown him that when they were in the DR. He'd tried not to keep tabs on her over the years, because the ache became too great, but from what he'd gathered that hadn't changed about her. He glanced at his watch. Old habit. Whether on duty or on call, he was always aware of the time. Often, someone's life would depend on how quickly he could act. If he was at the hospital and got a code, he always knew the time, and that helped him manage everything that came next. If he was on call and had to go in, the ticking clock between his location and his destination often prompted what actions he'd take depending on the diagnosis. During those days in Blue Bay Beach, time seemed to wash away. It didn't matter that the sun would be set by 9:30 or when he woke up. Have somewhere to be? She asked. For the first time in a long time, the answer is no. Are you on vacation or something? Or something? He turned to the waves. Their arms were still linked, and she stepped deeper into the water. He didn't move, and she was angled awkwardly ahead of him. He worried about what would happen if they went further, not because he feared the ocean. No, he feared the future. Cleo glanced over her shoulder, casting him a smile like a fishing line. His lips quirked. He couldn't help it. That was the lure, and she was quickly drawing him in. Hook. Line. Sinker. He couldn't let it happen. He'd fight if he had to. He didn't budge. As if getting a measure of his intention, her shoulders dropped. Was she disappointed? What kind of person would he be to give her the idea that he was interested on her wedding day? She was in shock. She'd only just run from that idiot Brian. Her family didn't know where she was. She'd washed up there and somehow found her way into his arms. That was not what was supposed to happen. He dropped his elbow from hers and suddenly went cold. It wasn't the water or air. August in South Florida was sweltering, but he'd chilled from her absence. Just as he had been for so many years. Cleo, about everything that happened. I'm sorry. He couldn't hold off any longer. He had to say it. She held up her hand. You said we can talk about that later. Later is good. Later. That meant they'd have more than right now. He had to hand it to her. She was clever. Was she torturing him for hurting her, drawing it out? Or was she actually inclined to spend more than a few impromptu minutes on a random beach with the guy who'd broken her heart? That sounded conceited, but she'd said it, or rather written it, to him in a letter. And he hadn't meant for her heart to break. He didn't mean for his heart to shatter either. Cleo took a deep breath. Ever want to just hop on a raft and sail away? Sounds like you'd soon be adrift. He certainly felt adrift. Better than being in a ditch, but maybe that's where I need to be. Just float on for a while. Easy breezy. No responsibilities. No messes to clean up. No wounds to heal. Caleb tilted his head from side to side. I'd prefer a boat to a raft, but yeah, sounds delightful. The tone of her voice made it impossible to tell if she was joking or not. As if moved by the mighty ocean itself or an invisible magnet, they'd incrementally moved closer to each other so they were standing side by side in the ankle-deep water. She inhaled. What really brought you here, Caleb? He let out a long-held breath. When I have the answer, I'll let you know. There was one very distinct answer, but he couldn't give it to her. Why specifically Blue Bay Beach? It was an out-of-the-way, forgotten town a friend told him about. His grandparents had a shanty there and would camp during the summer. It reminded him of his few fond memories of doing the same with his family in Australia. That was the best they could afford. And it had been enough. Because he couldn't linger on his past any longer, he said, "What have you been doing, aside from not getting married?" "I was working at a nonprofit, helped in my church's office. I was a care center volunteer a few times a week." Sounds busy. Multi-passionate, you could say. "I care about a lot of things. I, also have an online store." "A what?" "Just this little thing I do on the side." She wrung her hands. "Sounds like something you do on the side of on the side on the side." "How many on the sides was that?" She laughed mildly. He figured she'd be doing all sorts of things. She was always so creative and visionary, dedicated. "That would be my side hustle to the third power." Caleb chuckled. "What do you sell online?" "Well, I'd like to have a brick-and-mortar store someday. But I started with artisans in the Dominican Republic. I always admired the Larimar stones. I've also spread out to several other countries. It's a fair and ethical trading post of sorts. Artisanal jewelry and other crafts so people can make faith-filled purchases, knowing they're helping others. But, it's a secret. Top secret." He was joking. "Now, I'll have to," without warning, Cleo threw herself at him. She probably intended for him to catch her, but he lost his footing on the uneven sand beneath the water and they both started to topple toward the shallows, but at the last second he managed to keep them both upright. They both breathed heavily. His hands wrapped around her arms. They gazed into each other's eyes. It was dizzying. "Darn. My plan backfired. You know the saying about top secret messages. I guess you're indestructible." He laughed darkly. "Nope. Not at all." His body was still alive as evidenced by the jolt that wove through him in response to her, but for so many months up until then, it felt like the rest of him was slowly dying. "Are you mocking me about it being secret?" she asked with a wrinkle in her otherwise perfectly smooth brow. He shook his head. "I think the secret part is interesting. If it's secret, how do you make sales?" "It's secret from my family." "Did your ex know?" That was the litmus to determine what he'd just walked into. Not that he'd expect Cleo to lie or embellish the truth, but this was Sharky territory. There was no telling what that idiot Brian was all about. He had to tread carefully. Not that he intended to move in on her, but even just being with her woke something up within. Something he thought was hopeless. "No, I didn't tell Brian either, and not because I was afraid he'd shoot my idea down. Or just ignore me altogether, which is almost worse." Caleb snapped his fingers. "Shoot you down?" "Right, he was a missile." She laughed that time. "I started to tell Brian about Cana Market once, but he didn't get it. He was like an overgrown child. Rich. Trust fund. Never grew up. Didn't see beyond his privileged perspective of the world. That there was more out there. That some people had less. If you asked him what fair trade meant, he'd probably say something like, if you give me the War Heroes game, I'll trade you for Bandits and Mavericks because I already played it." She did a low and goofy imitation of a male's voice. Caleb chuckled. "Did you name it Cana Market like the Bible story?" "That and Punta Cana, Dominican Republic." They'd met there. That was what he was afraid of. He had to diminish the charge between them, sever the ties to their history. He had to be blunt. "Are you ashamed to do this great work?" She arched her eyebrow. "You're one to talk, walking away from mission work to be Mr. Dr. McCarty Fancy Pants." She had no idea what he'd walked into when he left mission work, but couldn't afford to turn the focus of the conversation on that. "McCarty?" he asked with amusement in his voice. "It's from a TV show." I was not likening him to you. Despite standing in the water, sweat beaded along her lip. He wondered if he'd let them fall as they nearly did a few minutes previous, if the sea would have washed away the pain of the past. Cleo thrust her shoulders back like she had something else to get off her chest. "It seems impossible from a biological perspective, but yes, you're more attractive with age. Isn't there a limit on what DNA can produce? If not that, wouldn't it make more sense that environmental and lifestyle factors would have made you less attractive over time?" She was bold. Always so honest. Spoke her mind. The tips of Caleb's ears heated, and he cleared his throat. "I can't answer that question, but can reference some medical studies. I'll get back to you with my findings," he said jokingly. "Back to your question then." "No, I'm not ashamed of my business. I'm afraid to fail just as I've failed at other things in my life. He frowned. To his mind, she was a success, a beautiful, smart, brave success. Name one thing you failed at. I haven't kept a record of what you've been doing over the years, but considering all the nonprofit and volunteer work you mentioned, it hardly seems like failure. Maybe you haven't found that one thing, but you were likely impacting people's lives in a meaningful way. Her green eyes landed on him with a hard stare. Didn't waver. It was like she intended to hold him accountable. Even if I haven't found my one thing, I had found my one person, Caleb. The fact that we've been talking for hours and I've told you more than I even bothered telling my sisters is evidence of that. But maybe I don't need one thing or one person. She started to walk away. Maybe she was right. Maybe she was wrong. But he couldn't lose her again. At least not yet.
Chapter 5. Cleo. Cleo didn't want to walk away from Caleb, but she couldn't bear to have her heart shred to bits again. Lifting her soggy dress, she tromped along the shoreline. Cleo, wait, he called. He caught up to her and spun her around. Her dress would have flared and whirled had it not been soaked. As it was, she was rooted to the spot. Listen, I'd like to keep talking. To catch up. To explain. She lifted an eyebrow and planted her fist on her hip. Yes, I deserve that look. I do. But it got complicated fast. Caleb gripped his hand on the back of his neck. Rarely did he look anything less than completely dignified. At the moment, he looked shy, sheepish, and boyish. Yes, she said, waiting. His eyes narrowed. Oh, if he got all righteous on her, he had another thing coming. What's that? He asked, pointing behind her to the shoreline. A cylinder-shaped glass bottle with a long neck topped with a cork jutted from the sand. They hurried toward it, both dropping to a crouch. Their eyes met, then turned back to the bottle. Looks like a message in a bottle, Cleo breathed, feeling a spark of curiosity. I think so. I've been walking this beach for weeks and I've spotted little more than some seashells. The glass had once been perfectly clear but had become cloudy from the sea. A bit of algae grew on the sides of the bottle and a strand of seaweed was wrapped around the neck. Cleo peered closer. It looks like there's something inside. A rolled-up piece of paper. Caleb carefully pulled it from the sand as though it were a precious relic. He held the bottle on its side so they could see the contents better. They both lifted their gaze at the same time. Want to come over? We can check it out. I'm sure I have something we can use to pull the paper from the bottle. Cleo bit her lip. Do you suppose we ought to? As soon as the question was out of her mouth, she had her answer. The balmy air, beach, and being with Caleb reminded her of being young and free. She wanted to hang on to that feeling. Never let it go. Everything that day had gone wrong, but the bottle was a distraction from her woes. And she wasn't quite ready to say goodbye to Caleb. Actually, let's do it. Yeah, he asked with a midge of excitement in his voice. Yeah, she repeated. And all that running away from my wedding got me thirsty. Hungry too, I bet. At least I am. It almost sounded like they were having a dinner date. At least they were past the tedium of the icebreakers Cleo had come to dread. As they passed through the gate and approached the giant Spanish-style mansion with clay roof tiles and white stucco, Cleo let out a low whistle. Being among the top surgeons in the world has treated you well. There was a hitch in his step and he said, This is just temporary. I'll be heading back to New York soon. You and me both. Or not. I could stand not to go back with my tail between my legs. Your tail is hardly between your legs. You were the one jilted at the altar. Technically, he was at the altar. I fled, Cleo clarified. He was at the altar on his phone with his gaming girlfriend. Venom laced Caleb's voice. It was odd to have him on her team when he was the one who'd originally broken her heart. Brian didn't matter now because he didn't have her heart to begin with. Palms and other greenery grew in lush clusters around the entry to the mansion. Caleb punched in a key code. She shook the sand off the hem of her dress. "Bienvenidas a casa," he said, sweeping his hand grandly. "Welcome home." They both spoke fluent Spanish, having studied it in high school and college, then applying it in real life during their time in the doctor. A staircase with a wrought iron railing stood in the center, colorful throw rugs covered tile flooring, and dark, rich wood beams supported the ceiling. It was spectacular. Caleb gestured to the stairs. "Would you like me to get you something to change into?" "As long as you don't mind me wearing this ridiculous thing a little longer, I'd like to keep it on. I feel like a princess in a fairy tale." He extended his hand as if he were going to caress her cheek and then plunked it down. "You look like one." "Gracias." Caleb checked his watch. "Somewhere you need to be?" she asked. He shook out his wrist. "No. Sorry. Force of habit. You used to live and die by that thing. Sometimes it was a matter of life and death if I had to check on a patient after treatment, surgery, or for those with certain conditions. You know what they say about old habits." "Are you on the clock?" He clicked his tongue. "Nope. Nowhere I need to be." "Good. Then be here." Classic Cleo mic drop. She brushed past him and toward the kitchen. No matter how big the house, Cleo could always locate the kitchen. No matter how posh the party, oftentimes, the kitchen was where guests ended up congregating. "Let's have something to eat then and check out this bottle," Caleb said, giving her a glass of water. "I also have sweet tea, lemonade, and fresh squeezed Florida orange juice." She lifted her glass to indicate she was good. The fridge was stocked, and he whipped them up a salad, warmed a couple of sweet potatoes and grilled chicken. He always ate so clean and healthy. If she was honest, it was a little boring, but he probably saw so many diet and lifestyle-related ailments in his line of work that he couldn't very well contradict what he told patients about diet and wellness. She sent her sisters and mother a quick text on their group chat, explaining she was fine and had run into an old friend. What were the chances? He set their plates at the kitchen island and they said a blessing together. While she was on the service mission in the DR, he'd always join the team for dinner and lead the blessing. When Caleb was in doctor mode, he was all command, all alpha. But when he spoke of God with such love and humility in his voice, she felt the extent of his faith. He reminded her that even a belief as small as a mustard seed was significant and could yield great things. That was what drove her to help people. Even if it seemed small or insignificant, extending a kindness could change someone's life. They chatted while they ate dinner and they both kept glancing at the bottle standing on its end across from them on the island. She felt her excitement building. What did it contain? Her phone beeped a few times. Her sisters were texting a mile a minute. She quickly typed that she was still okay in the time since she'd texted them 10 minutes earlier and she'd contact them again soon with details. Then she clicked off her phone. She waved it in her hand and said, "I noticed you don't have one of these in your pocket. Are you off the grid, hiding away here in paradise?" Something along those lines. He chewed the inside of his lip. "Was it your divorce?" Her tone wasn't prying but inviting. She'd certainly chewed his ear off about her troubles. If he needed someone to lean on, she'd be there for him. Sadness etched into the small lines around his eyes. "I'm here partly because of my failed marriage, but it was broken from the beginning. Like I said, I was too focused on my career. I should have seen the fractures early on. It's better we're not together." You could say I'm taking a pause to reassess my life. My direction. His Australian accent had depth and meaning behind it. She didn't want to press. Should we clean up and check out this bottle? I'll get the dishes later. Let's see what washed up on shore. He passed her the bottle. You do the honors. She pulled the cork. For a split second, she half expected a genie to emerge, but that was a different fantasy story altogether. He slipped one of his skilled and steady surgeon fingers into the mouth of the bottle and lifted the scroll out. Again, their eyes met. A silent question. Should we keep going? Cleo gave him an assuring nod. She leaned closer as he unrolled the paper. He smelled of aftershave and sea salt. She breathed deep. The only thing missing was the scent of sunblock, and she'd have drifted back in time 10 years previous to that hot Dominican Republic summer. They both studied the letter printed in old calligraphy-style penmanship and heavy ink. It was written in Spanish, but they both easily translated it. For many years over the sea, I have sailed. I sought that which cannot be bought or sold. A great many folk has sought riches and gold. My treasure will not leave you lonely or cold. Whosoever finds this booty will be blessed with fortunes untold. But know that abundance and prosperity favor the bold. The greatest wealth of knowledge comes from the old. I am the pirate who broke the mold. Signed. I can't read the signature, Cleo said. Caleb recited the lines under his breath. Shivers skittered across her skin. Sounds like a romantic pirate if you ask me, Cleo said with a giggle. Caleb gazed at the note as though lost in thought. He grabbed a set of reading glasses from the counter and peered at the letter. Look, he said softly. There's a faint line here. Do you see it? Cleo pulled out her phone and shone the light on it. The line he pointed to illuminated. They followed it in a disjointed ring partially hidden behind the inked words until it ended at a faint letter X. There were just lines. No landmasses or anything to indicate where it was. The bottle could have sailed halfway around the world before washing up here, Caleb said smartly. So this is an actual treasure map? Cleo asked with glee in her voice. I think we found ourselves an adventure, Caleb answered. She turned to him, practically bouncing on her toes. Do you think we should try to solve it? Caleb smiled a full, real smile that reached his eyes, the kind that reminded her of that summer they'd spent together. It also reminded her of how much she'd lost. It was one thing to forgive him. It was another to forget. We? As in us? Solve something? I think we should address our problems first. Head on. You're the guy who saves lives with a gentle bedside manner 1 minute, then a big shot doctor with a cocky attitude who disappears the next. How am I supposed to reconcile the two? He held up his hands. Hold up. You think I'm cocky? You think I save lives? Well, I wasn't exactly a damsel in distress back there, but yes, if you recall, you did save my life 10 years ago. Then you disappeared. It's confusing. It hurt. She felt vulnerable being so honest, but she couldn't hold back any longer. Caleb didn't back away as she half expected. He brushed a loose hair from her cheek. How do I reconcile the two? How do you? We don't. I lost someone. I can't talk about it just yet. His voice was strained. I just put myself out there and told you what I was feeling. I was bold, Caleb. She shook her head, instantly regretting it. I have to leave. Why? Right now? Where are you going? I was wondering if I could see you again. A grumble escaped. She had no idea where to go. She couldn't face her family and friends. No, it was her mother she wasn't excited to see. He met her in the hall. I'm sorry about what happened, Cleo. Truly. But I understand this is a tough time for you. After everything is settled in your personal life, could we get together? Maybe I could explain. What I'm asking for is a second chance. Maybe we could be friends, and if not, that perhaps closure on that part of our lives. Heat and pressure built behind her thoughts and words. The truth is, Caleb, I don't want closure. I want things to go back to the way they were. But I know that's impossible. Tears sprang to her eyes, but she fought them off. His hands gently gripped her shoulders. Another shiver raced through her limbs and all the way to her heart. I didn't mean to hurt you. It was a confusing, tough time. He smoothed his hand down his face. Yeah. Tell me about it. My life lately hasn't exactly been a picnic. A picnic. Will you go on a picnic with me sometime? Hope flared in her chest, replacing the anger. Maybe they could fix things, but could she trust him? A picnic? Yeah. Sure. It's not like I have anything better to do. And it wasn't like she could say no to the guy who'd once owned her heart. He blanched. I can't tell if you're being sarcastic. I'm not. I can't show my face. At least not yet. The mess of her failed wedding was overwhelming and caused her heart to race, but not in a good way. Do you need a place to stay? You can stay here as long as you like. I have plenty of space. A stupid amount of space for just one person. His fingers found hers and laced through, gripping tightly. The home was spacious, gorgeous, and a secret. No one knew where she was. She nodded hesitantly. Thank you. Actually, that would be great. And we can think on that message from the pirate, he said with laughter in his voice. And don't forget about that picnic. She had to find out why he'd disappeared from her life. He showed her upstairs, leaving her in a guest room with a four-poster bed that had gauzy fabric draped around the top. The slatted Bermuda shutters were open, letting in the last light before setting in the west. Outside, birds sang their final songs of the day and cicadas chirped, greeting the incoming night. Caleb excused himself for a moment and brought her an extra shirt. You'll find a toothbrush and pretty much anything else you'll need in your bathroom there. The homeowners had this place stocked. He pointed to the door behind her. As he said goodnight and closed the door, she had the thought that she needed him. After taking off the wedding dress and showering, she pulled on Caleb's t-shirt. It was soft and worn and smelled just like him. She couldn't bear the idea of taking it off. Keyed up from the scent, encountering Caleb, their find on the beach, and the botched wedding, she finally called her sisters. Are you okay? Christy asked. Where are you? Karen piped up. What on earth is going on? Her mother's voice came last. They must have had the phone on speaker. We've been dreadfully worried, Christy said. Almost send out a search party, Karen added. Do you have any idea the amount of explaining I had to do? Her mother intoned. She tried to keep the questions straight and keep herself from blowing up at her mother. It was always about Winona. Long ago, Cleo had learned to let her mother's self-centeredness go and not take it personally, but sometimes it tried her patience more than others. For once, she wanted her mother to be on her side, to be thinking about her feelings. She was the one whose wedding day was blown up by a human missile. I'm fine. I'm staying with a friend in a nearby town. As for what's going on? Christy, Karen, if you want to explain the but rap song ringtone to Mom, be my guest. The bullet point is that Brian was cheating. He was a loser. It never would have worked. I just saved you from having to pay your lawyers the big bucks when we ended up getting divorced like you and Dad. You don't even sound sad about it. Winona huffed. There was an edge to her voice that she couldn't deny. I suppose not. I cried earlier. Now, I'm mad at the jerk. Well, I figured you needed some time to cool off, Christy said. You sure you don't want us to come get you? Karen asked. Thanks, girls. I love you both. You too, Mom. But I'm okay. I think I'm exactly where I need to be. Tomorrow, I'm going on a treasure hunt. I'll check in again soon. Good night. She hung up before they had the chance to protest. Cleo and Caleb would go on a treasure hunt. Maybe they'd even have a second summer fling, but keep it simple. It was the perfect distraction from her troubles and so much like when they'd originally met. There was just under a month left of the summer. They could spend the remaining time together. That would also give her time to figure things out. It would be harmless. It would provide closure. And then it would be over.
Chapter 6. Caleb. Caleb sat on the balcony overlooking the sea where he'd been before he'd went on a walk and found Cleo. Her presence awoke something in him that he'd all but left behind on the beaches of the Dominican Republic. She was so refreshingly honest, had a ton of energy, and beauty he'd never encountered in another woman. She'd said that he was the one. Her one person. She'd been the same for him. His heart fluttered with hope. There were reasons they couldn't be together. But he couldn't tell her. Not after what happened. But he wanted to. He wanted to explain why he wasn't at the hospital. Why he was no longer working. But he couldn't because what haunted him meant something to her too. He glanced at his watch. Yes, it was an old habit, but under the protection of night, he could be honest with himself. He'd become obsessed with the time his mentor had died. 11:59 a.m. was when he uttered the words that burned his mind. His soul. Time of death. 11:59 a.m. It was like every time that specific hour and minute came around he relived the loss. It didn't matter if it was night or day. He checked his watch to account for every hour that he still lived and breathed, and the greatest man he'd ever known no longer did. Caleb held his head in his hand and let the gently lapping waves in the distance, the salt water, do what he couldn't. He went to the ocean because he needed some release. Part of him wanted to cry, but tears wouldn't come. The pain bottled up inside him. Cleo wasn't wrong about him being a cocky doctor and having a gentle bedside manner. He was both. He had to be. He had to be confident, assured, and never weak. Never, ever weak. He'd learned that hard lesson when growing up. Only the strong survive. So that's what he became. He strengthened himself physically by working out so he could endure long periods of time in the ore. He strengthened himself mentally so there was never uncertainty or doubt in his mind. His faith was strong, and he prayed and attended church services. But there was another component to strength: emotional health. That was where he was lacking. He was afraid to feel anything other than guilt and shame. Love terrified him because he knew if it wasn't returned, he'd be vulnerable. Open to loss. And he couldn't shoulder another. The next morning, Caleb was up early and in the kitchen. The day was already warm, and the sun baked the tile as he quietly got to work. He made his usual egg white omelet and protein plus green juice. He'd much prefer a big ol' slab of bacon, some fried eggs, maybe even grits like they served in town, but he'd seen the havoc those wrought on the arteries and ate clean. However, he had a guest, so he allowed for an indulgence, something he recalled Cleo enjoying. Just as he poured the light and sweet in a tall glass, Cleo entered the kitchen, looking sleepy and adorable in his t-shirt. It was far too big for her, but wrapping her in his softest cotton top was the closest he could come to giving her an actual hug, something he longed to do. Buenos dias. She repeated the greeting in Spanish, and then her mouth dropped and she scampered to the counter. She feasted her eyes on the light and sweet. I never thought I'd have one of these again. He beamed. Glad to make her happy. Today is your lucky day. If we find the treasure, I'm going to pay you to make me one of these every day, she said. No need to pay me. I'll do it for free. Then how will you afford this place? They were joking around. That was a good sign. He couldn't imagine how difficult and confusing the previous day was. His mother used to always say that a good night's rest put things in perspective. Bringing the whipped, creamy coffee drink to her lips, Cleo closed her eyes. She took a small sip, savoring it. When she set the glass down, she had a tiny bit of cream above her lip. Caleb took the risk and gently wiped it away with his thumb. Goodness, he missed her lips. Swallowing thickly, he said, "You had some cream there." She cocked her head. "I was saving that for later." Then she laughed and took another sip. "As good as you remember?" "Better." She grinned. "As they say, absence makes the heart grow fonder." "Oh, I thought the saying was absence makes the heart grow bitter." Dark laughter filled her voice as though reminding him that she hadn't forgotten that he had some explaining to do. He didn't blame her, but relief flushed through him when she didn't kick him out of his own house. He'd have deserved it. He deserved worse. I figured I ought to start to mend things between us by plying you with sugar, cream, and coffee. You know, the light and sweet was what won me over the first time, she said, breaking the tension. He did. It had been a late night and then an early morning at the clinic in the Dominican Republic. He was a volunteer doctor, determined to save the world. She was on a service mission trip and assigned to help in his area. The night before, they'd both been up late with a woman and her son who was gravely ill. While Caleb treated him and Cleo assisted, they'd both prayed with his mother. And prayed and prayed. The following morning, he made Cleo a light and sweet. He knew it would be another long day in an area ravaged by a tropical storm causing unclean water, limited resources, and many injuries on top of regular illness. The locals were swamped and Caleb was assigned to help. But it was exhausting. They found out that the boy survived the night and the next and the next. About 4 years ago, I received a letter from Alonzo Perez. The boy that first night. I was thrown right into the fire. I had no idea what to do, so I prayed and followed your orders. Caleb nodded. You did beautifully. They'd worked so perfectly as a team. In the letter, Alonzo thanked me, and my helper, for saving his life. I was just doing my job. It's more than a job, and you know that. Last night, I saw you smile the way you used to. I know you've seen anguish and sorrow, and yet you still smile. Whatever is weighing heavily on you, Caleb. Whatever it is, it'll be okay. He wasn't so sure about that and wanted to get off the topic that skated so close to the recent loss that did indeed fill him with anguish and sorrow unlike any he'd ever known. Cleo got up from the counter stool and stepped closer to him. Her hair was still rumpled from sleep. She had a little line on her cheek from her pillow. He wanted to see her every morning like this. A ragged breath escaped. She placed her hand on his and gazed into his eyes. Caleb, you saved my life too when I got dengue fever. Remember? I thought I was just tired. We were working so hard. You were burning up. It's hot in the DR. The nosebleed was the telltale sign. I fainted, and you took care of me. You healed me. You saved me. That's more than a job, Caleb. It's a gift. Silence laced between them. A long silence. But Caleb couldn't think of anything to fill it. His mind was blank except for the pain and guilt and shame of what had happened more recently. The person he couldn't save. What he couldn't say. However, it was like the story, the truth was begging to be released. Cleo was the first to speak. I just prayed for you. For us. Whatever needs to be said will be said. I ask that whatever truths need to be revealed will be revealed. And in whatever areas we need to find peace, we will. The sentiment washed over Caleb like a mighty tide. Thank you, Cleo. Just doing my job. She winked. It melted him. But he had to stay focused. He'd hardly gotten over the fact of her. He'd measured every woman he'd ever dated against her. A little twinge of hope fired inside. Because she didn't hate him. That was a good sign. But she would soon enough. The back and forth banter of his mind was making him seasick. She took the last sip of the light and sweet. Do you know that I went to every cafe in New York City looking for a replica of this? You call it a light and sweet, but it's also called Dalgona coffee, beaten coffee, whips, fraps. But it's never been the same. You make it best. I'll take that as high praise since you sampled all that New York had to offer. Okay, maybe not all, but anytime it was on the menu, I had to order it. There was a flirty suggestion between them and Caleb felt that hope again. But he had to stamp it out. He had to be strong. Because if Cleo was his weakness, he was in trouble. There is only one light and sweet worth drinking. She set her glass in the sink and started to clean up their breakfast. He tried to get her to sit down and relax, but she said, "Let me earn my keep," and batted him away. After she showered and he went into town to get her some clothes from the boutique, he prepared them a picnic lunch to take to the beach. It was a beautiful day, but as the dreadful hour that haunted him daily crept closer, the truth in his mind got louder. Thankfully, Cleo wasn't in the room with him at 11:59 and the moment passed. She was trying on the new wardrobe he'd bought her. Not having any idea what she liked or her exact size, Caleb bought half the shop's inventory. Cleo emerged wearing a blue and white striped sundress, a wide-brimmed cream-colored hat and stroppy sandals with gems on the thongs. She twirled in front of him. Fabulous if I do say so myself. She stopped her spin by gripping the center of his button-down shirt. You did quite well shopping for a woman. For the briefest of moments, she was so close he could see the faint spray of freckles over her nose. He thought she was going to kiss him. Abruptly, she lowered from her toes and turned away. He felt cold all over again. It was like Cleo was a fire that kept him warm. I had help. The gal at the boutique was about your size, he said, but his voice was gravelly. Well, thank you. I never want to see that wedding dress again. If it wouldn't pollute the ocean, I'd send it out to sea. Caleb laughed as he gathered up the picnic basket. Once at the beach, they spread out a blanket and dug into the sandwiches and salad he'd prepared. They sat side by side with their legs out long, watching the waves roll in and out. The picnic basket was between them. Cleo leaned her elbow on it and gazed at him. I was thinking. Maybe we were being led to this moment. Together. Everything bad and unpleasant that happened brought us here so we could have this. And when this is over, he asked. Does it have to be? Remember our dreams. During that summer we planned adventures and expeditions to help people. We said we'd kiss in every country. What if we find that treasure and we make it happen? She was a dreamer. A visionary. She could see the future bold and bright. He could not. There were things she wanted that he couldn't give her. I can't give you what you want, Cleo, he said. What? Why not? Do you have a secret gambling problem and the mob is after you or owe the IRS a ton of money and are going to jail? He wanted to laugh but couldn't. You said that your ex didn't want kids and that you do. I can't give you that. The cry of the gulls filled the air, but between them was quiet. I'm sorry, Caleb. I didn't know. She took a deep breath. But do you want kids? He nodded. I do. Very much. She smiled. Then it's not a problem. You want a baseball team-sized family. How is that not a problem? You and I both know that there are countless babies and children around the world that need a home. She didn't say the word adopt, but she didn't need to. It's not a deal breaker. No, but what he hadn't yet said would be.
Chapter 7. Cleo. Cleo tugged Caleb to his feet. I didn't leave my wedding yesterday to sulk around. Life is short. Today is the first day of the rest of our lives. We are going to wipe that frown off your face and have ourselves an adventure. She planted her feet wide with her palms on her hips because she wasn't fooling around. A smirk played on his lips. Okay, boss. That's more like it. She knew something was bothering Caleb, but if it was just that he couldn't have kids of his own, well, it wasn't a problem. There were other ways, adoption among them. Some women may have been able to birth 10 kids in their lifetime, but Cleo's biological clock was ticking and she didn't think she'd be able to produce that many in the time she had left. But creating a family could still happen. They returned to the house, put away the picnic supplies, and then pulled out the letter from the scroll. For many years over the sea, I have sailed. I sought that which cannot be bought or sold. A great many folk has sought riches and gold. My treasure will not leave you lonely or cold. Whosoever finds this booty will be blessed with fortunes untold. But know that abundance and prosperity favor the bold. The greatest wealth of knowledge comes from the old. I am the pirate who broke the mold. Signed. Where do we start? Cleo asked. Who's the pirate that broke the mold? And what kind of mold are we talking about? She wrinkled her nose. Caleb blinked a few times and then said, I know. I'll be right back. He disappeared from the room and then returned seconds later holding a thick, leather-bound book. A bit of light reading, I see. He smirked. I wanted to unplug from technology and, got bored, so I went to the local library and grabbed this. The title page read The Leagues of the Gulf. It's a fascinating recount of the maritime history of Florida. Caleb flipped the pages. and the pirates that scourged the sea and plundered the land. Focused on finding whatever it was he was looking for, he reached for his glasses. Cleo passed them to him. After putting them on, she warmed through. Somehow, he looked even more handsome, more distinguished with the frames. He glanced up at her and she quickly looked away, feeling her cheeks heat. He stabbed the page. Found it. She leaned in to read the passage. The Spanish ship Floribel sailed from 1649 until 1715, when historians claim she sunk off the shallow coast of Fort Pierce on the eastern side of Florida. There were 11 ships in the fleet that went down in the disaster and many lives were lost. The ships primarily contained silver and merchandise to trade, however, the Floribel's manifest reported she contained much more, including gold, rare gems, and other artifacts. Although they salvaged much of the silver, they never recovered the ship and other treasure. Luis Alejandro Ruiz, a crewman on board, is said to have been the sole survivor on board the Floribel. Supposedly, he went overland to the Gulf Coast and there embarked upon the life of a pirate. He boasted that he possessed the Floribel treasure, which quickly became legendary. Cleo met Caleb's eyes. "Do you think that's our treasure?" Caleb turned the page. "Keep reading." Luis Alejandro Ruiz obtained his own ship, a British brigantine called the Voyager. With it, he sailed throughout the Gulf and Caribbean during the golden age of piracy. If he'd had the famed treasure from the Floribel, it's not well understood why he engaged in piracy. In 1729, the Voyager was discovered wrecked off Port Royal in Jamaica. Ruiz was never recovered. The last known account of him alive was on the deck of his ship throwing what looked like a glass bottle into the sea as the boat went down. The story hung in the air between them. "Do you think?" Cleo asked. Caleb smiled. "There's only one way to find out." His hand gripped hers and they got to their feet. A thrill rushed through her. At the discovery and adventure as well as at Caleb's touch. "Where do we start?" Her questions were as much thinking aloud as they were asking him for answers. This line here, "The greatest wealth of knowledge comes from the old." It made me think of this book, which made me think of the library. The one in town is small. Part book lending service and part historical society. Cleo grinned as the excitement built. "Let's go." The walk into town was short, and they soon arrived at the old stucco building. It was small, but so was the town's population. She was relieved not to be wearing the wedding dress and seeing the place with fresh eyes. It was quaint and lovely. A place anyone would be proud to call home. The air in the library was cool and the lights dim. A small woman with a shock of white hair sat behind the desk, reading. She looked up when the bells on the door rang. "Good afternoon." "Ah, I remember you," she said to Caleb. "Never forget a handsome face." "I'm Caleb and this is Cleo." "I'm Betty." "Nice to meet you both." "I take it you got your bridal gown situation sorted out," she said in a concerned voice. "Small town for sure." "Yes." "Long story." "They always are and love stories are always worth it." Betty winked. Caleb held out the book. "I borrowed this about a week ago." Fascinating stuff. There was mention of a pirate named Luis Alejandro Ruiz. "Ah, yes, El Barbaroja y Isabel," she said. "Red Beard and Isabel. The greatest love story of all time." "Greatest? Then why don't we know about it?" Betty shrugged. "I suppose it has yet to be written, but that doesn't make it any less great. I grew up here and oh, the tales my father used to tell." Everything you read about Luis Alejandro Ruiz in that book is true except one thing. He was a pirate but more of the Robin Hood style. He never took a life and was fair and just. My understanding is he helped people, gave what he could, and spread the wealth. In other words, he broke the mold. Cleo's eyes lit up. The corners of Caleb's lips lifted in understanding. I suppose you could say that, Betty said. Cleo looked at Caleb and he nodded. Betty seemed like someone they could trust. We were on the beach yesterday and found a glass bottle stopped with a cork, he said. Inside, we found this. Cleo smoothed the note on the counter between them. Betty read, then gasped. I do believe you've been chosen. What do you mean? They both asked at the same time. Legend has it that this bottle would only show up to those worthy of the challenge and more importantly worthy of the treasure. So there is a treasure? The Floribel was said to contain vast amounts of wealth. Greater than the other ships combined. Betty removed her reading glasses. Surely, Luis wouldn't have been able to take it with him overland. Betty waggled her eyebrows. It's astonishing what those determined and fueled by love can do. What was that you said about the greatest love story? Cleo asked. That you'll have to find out on your own, but I can tell you this. Back in Spain, Luis had been in love with a young woman named Isabel. She was a lovely girl with a big heart, inclined to help others. She came from a wealthy family, but he didn't have much to offer her family for her dowry. That's how things were done in those days. He was an honorable fellow and wanted to offer his love the best life and not pull her into the poverty he'd grown up in. He had the opportunity to take the voyage on the Floribel and would be paid well upon his return. With his pockets filled, he'd then confidently marry Isabel. But that was not to be. Betty shook her head. No, the storm off the eastern side of Florida took the fleet by surprise and sunk the 11 ships. But the Floribel's treasure was never recovered. Many say Luis was intending to take his portion back to Spain and to his love. I don't suppose he ever made it, Cleo said. Which makes it a tragic love story. Ah, but Luis was never found, so we'll never know, will we? The three of them were quiet for a moment as Betty studied the letter. My eyes aren't what they used to be, but I think this is Luis's signature. If you think the treasure is out there, I suggest starting at the founder's statue in the town common. Blue Bay Beach isn't paved with gold, but Hernando Olivar sure thought it was. Thank you, you've been very helpful, Cleo said. Do you mind if I hang on to this book a little longer? Caleb asked. Be my guest. And if you find anything, well, even if you don't, be sure to stop by the Coconut Cove Cafe and have some pie. You won't be sorry. It's one of the town's greatest treasures if I do say so myself. Cleo was so excited, so filled with purpose, she couldn't imagine being sorry. As she moved toward the exit, a wall with sepia-framed photographs caught her attention. They moved back in time as if rewinding history. The first showed the town as recently as the early 2000s, then shots of the same area taken at 10-year intervals until 1900. The photographs turned into sketches until they reached an old map of the area. There was something about it that was familiar. Caleb, Cleo called as he said goodbye to Betty. Check this out. They were on the other end of the library and away from where Betty could see or hear them. The older woman was right. He did have a handsome face. A face she wanted to gaze at when she woke up and be the last thing she saw when she blinked her eyes closed and said goodnight. His face was clean-shaven and his eyes bright as he studied the map. His lips quirked when he caught her staring at him instead of the artifact on the wall. Do you see? She asked, breaking her fog. It resembles the map we found in the bottle. Caleb nodded in awe as he held up the letter with the faint outline of a map hidden behind the words. It probably would have been more effective if Luis drew the map on the back. Unless only the worthy can see it, as Betty said. Good point. They said goodbye again and went outside to locate the founder's statue. It was in the town common by the boardwalk and reef rentals close to the northern shore. A man was sculpted in bronze, riding atop what looked like a dolphin. A plaque beneath the statue gave details about the founding of Blue Bay Beach and the founding father. Caleb read, Olivar is quoted to have said, Blue Bay Beach is believed to be a place glittering with gold for those who know how to look for treasure. Then why was it named Blue Bay Beach? Why not Gold Bay Beach? Caleb chortled. Seems like Hernando had a sense of humor. And a sweet tooth. Look, with his left hand, Hernando is pointing at Auntie M's candy shop. I could go for some taffy, Cleo said. This feels like a dead end, but let's go check it out, Caleb said. Maybe not for those who know how to look for treasure. Caleb's eyes crinkled with his smile. The look he gave her told Cleo that he already had found something special. Being with him felt like an endless summer, and it was only just beginning.
Chapter 8. Caleb. Cleo's hand in his was tentative at first. He looked from their joined palms to her green eyes as if to confirm he wasn't going to let go again. He wouldn't write. He'd figure out a way to tell her the truth. He had to. Being together fulfilled him in a way little else did. From her soft laughter to her bright smile to her insight. She was the perfect woman for him. The one he'd found. The one he'd lost. The one who'd washed up on the beach. Well, not quite but close enough. As they crossed the town common toward the candy store, he didn't even think about checking the time. At least not until he was inside. The architecture in Blue Bay Beach varied from Spanish and Mediterranean-style structures with stucco walls and tile roofs like the mansion to Victorian like the sandy shore into coastal contemporary. There were also the beach cottages which had a craftsman-style bungalow vibe. Then there were Cape-style buildings and houses sprinkled in. They typically had clapboard shingles or whitewashed wooden exteriors. Auntie M's candy shop had just such an exterior and reminded Caleb of a general store like the kind in northern towns. Awnings with black and gold stripes provided shade for the windows. Through the glass, Cleo and Caleb watched a metal contraption pull and twist a ribbon of pale yellow saltwater taffy. That looks good enough to eat, Cleo said. She squeezed his hand and drew him inside. Chilly air conditioning greeted them along with the sweet scent of sugar. Lining the walls were displays filled with every kind of candy imaginable. From retro treats to recent confections. Caleb recognized some of his favorites, rarities when he was a kid. Even rarer as an adult since he didn't often indulge. Tubs of fresh taffy were by the windows, but in the middle was a long blue Formica counter backed by an old-fashioned soda fountain and ice cream dispenser. A chalkboard sign advertised the usual soft drinks along with sundaes, floats, milkshakes, and the option of a Brooklyn or Manhattan-style egg cream. Oh, my goodness. I used to love getting an egg cream with my dad. Cleo bounced on her toes. It broke his heart. He swallowed thickly. Are you a Brooklyn or Manhattan-style girl? He patted the chrome and blue swivel stool that was attached to the black and white tile floor. Brooklyn, baby, she said with a cheer. My father was from Brooklyn. Self-made man. Came from nothing. Married my mother and he said he still had nothing. That's not a marriage in my opinion. But I guess that's not for me to judge. Cleo perused the menu when a teenager, wearing a retro soda jerk uniform complete with an apron and folded paper hat with a blue stripe, asked to take their order. I'll play it safe with just a Dr. Pepper soda. Oh, you don't want to be a little more adventurous? Cleo asked, leaning into him with a giggle. We are on a treasure hunt, after all. You'll need your strength. Yeah, he needed his strength and then some. While they waited, they caught up on what they'd learned so far. I wonder if Blue Bay Beach would still look like Hernando's version of paradise. Caleb asked. I think so. I love it here. I never want to leave. Who would have thought a hidden, magical place like this existed? The kid brought their beverages. Cleo took one long sip. As delicious as I remember, but nothing compares to your light and sweet, Caleb. I love how creamy you make them, but this is a nice treat, she said. He fiddled with his straw, trying not to reveal what it cost him to see her drinking the egg cream. She carried on talking. Yep. I like it here. A lot. The people are so friendly. I guess I'd get used to everyone knowing everyone else's business. Betty was very nice. If I had been a stranded, runaway bride, I imagine she'd have helped me out. Instead, it was you who came to my rescue. She leaned against him and tucked her head under his chin. Caleb wrapped his arm around her. He inhaled her vanilla cream scent. She was good enough to eat. He took a long sip of the soda. It was as if they were two teens on a date in the old days. What he'd give if it were only that simple. Nonetheless, Caleb let himself smile. When Cleo had drained her glass, she turned to him. Wearing a thin little milk mustache, he moved to wipe it away. She smirked, licking it from her lip. Beat you to it. She was all smiles and laughter. He wished he could take a snapshot and preserve it in time. What he had to tell her wasn't only that he couldn't give her the children she wanted. He feared it would be worse. Okay, snack break over. Back to our adventure, Cleo said, tugging him from his dismal thoughts. Her smile was so wide he couldn't help but be drawn in. He had right then with Cleo. Right then. He knew well enough that not even a minute was promised to a person. He decided that instant to forget about the past for as long as possible and treasure the time that they did have together while it lasted. So the message in the bottle prompted you to share the article in the book which led us to the library. Betty so kindly pointed us in the direction of the Founding Fathers statue. He very clearly pointed us to Auntie M's candy shop. Cleo slid from the stool and turned in a slow circle. I will definitely be coming back here. But for now. She drifted off in the direction of the bins of taffy surrounding the taffy puller by the window. The display on the wall held smaller amounts in a variety of flavors such as bubble gum, cherry, watermelon, and peppermint. However, the prominent display was under a sign written in a similar style calligraphy as the letter from the bottle. It said pieces of 8 for pirates with a sweet tooth. Emphasis on tooth, Caleb said, making a joke about pirates having poor dental hygiene. Cleo laughed lightly. Fortunately, I brush, floss, and gargle, she answered, making the word gargle sound like a pirate exclaiming arg. So I will help myself to 8 pieces of 8. She plucked one of each flavor, peanut butter, honey, toffee, butterscotch, caramel, vanilla, banana, and lemon. They were all shades of yellowish gold. I thought you said snack break was over. Treasure hunting works up an appetite. Anyway, you know me better than that. I have a sweet tooth, Caleb. He was sweet for her. That was for sure. I also think this is clever. They have 8 kinds of gold taffy and call it pieces of 8. The young man from the counter approached them. He pressed the frames of his glasses up with his finger and adjusted his apron. I heard you talking about the taffy. My Aunt Mabel came up with that years ago. She thought it was clever too. I suspect if she were still around, she'd appreciate your compliment. Cleo, as warm and effusive as ever, said, I'm sorry about your aunt, but it seems like her memory lives on right here within these walls. This is a special place you have here. Why, thank you. My parents keep talking about selling it, but I have a year left of high school and think I might like to take over. Keep the family business going. No college or business school? Caleb asked. I started learning the ropes here when I was barely tall enough to reach the bins of candy. Just a lad, really. I love this place and have ideas for how to improve things, increase revenue, and get online without losing our small town, old school charm. I like the way you think. I can't imagine you'll be anything short of successful. I'm Cleo, by the way. What's your name? She extended her hand to shake. I'm Caleb. No way, his name is Caleb too. Cleo thumbed him. It's a great name. Caleb nodded cordially. Can I help you find anything else? The young Caleb asked. Cleo tilted her head. Caleb smiled. Now that you mention it, yes. They explained the message in the bottle, the book, Luis Alejandro Ruiz, and Betty's insights. Young Caleb's eyes lit up. Wow. This is amazing. Fascinating. It is pretty cool, Cleo said. Also because whenever someone would move here, Auntie M used to say, the golden road leads to Blue Bay Beach. Both Cleo and Caleb tilted their heads at the same angle at the same time. She was a storyteller. A character for sure. My dad said she ate too much sugar. But I always believed her. Or at least wanted to. She would tell a story that when she was a little girl, one day, the white sands right out there on the beach turned to gold for just about a full 24 hours. 11:59 a.m. one day as the tide came in until it washed back out. Said she never saw anything like it. The sun was golden in the sky. The sand was gold. Said it was a glorious sight. She knew it had something to do with the pirate treasure. The one brought from the Florable. You said the golden road leads to Blue Bay Beach. Caleb rubbed the light stubble growing in on his chin, pondering the puzzling words as he paced. Caleb, Cleo said. Both guys turned in her direction. She approached him and pointed to the floor. Look at what you're walking on. Beneath his feet, a line of faded and scuffed golden tiles split the black and white blocks. A carpet covered part of it along with various displays and shelves. He paused as realization dawned. It's a compass rose. Do you think it has anything to do with the treasure? Cleo asked. Looking around, in addition to the blue, white, and black motif of the shop, there were a few accents of gemstones and, more notably, gold. The old-fashioned cash register keys were gold, but so were other, seemingly random things. But they were somewhat specific too. On the sign for pieces of 8, the E was gold but not the rest of the letters. On the menu, the L for the lollipop display was gold. Did you make these signs, Caleb? Cleo asked the young man. No. They've been here since Auntie M made them. I thought of updating them, but imagine funds would be better invested elsewhere. Have you noticed any other letters that are gold among the rest that are printed in black? Caleb asked. Sure. There's the I for ice cream there. He pointed. Ah, and the S for sweets over there by the penny candy. Let's see. A for caramel apples and B for butterscotch by the homemade chocolates. Caleb grabbed a pen and scribbled them down on the back of the receipt from the soda fountain. Bay eyes. Is it like a word scramble? Cleo asked. Could be. He tried to make sense of it. Cleo smiled at young Caleb. Thank you. You've been super helpful. I spend a lot of time here. Tend to notice things. Do you know if the compass rose tiles mean anything? Young Caleb shrugged. Ornamental, I suppose. It's always been covered by all this stuff. Although, if you look here, this one almost looks like an arrow. Young Caleb pulled a display out from the southwestern corner of the shop. See? He shrugged. Never made sense to me. Standing by the window, Cleo bounced. The sun shone on her, casting her in golden light. Her hair lifted from her shoulders in shiny sheets. She was so beautiful. He let out a rough sigh. I think you're right. It is an arrow. Pointing southwest. She peered out the window. He could only see the dock with the Coconut Cove restaurant, some sailboats, and people on the beach. I don't know what it could mean, but thanks again. Do update me if you find anything, young Caleb said. We certainly will, Caleb answered and shook the kid's hand. He realized what had been bothering him earlier. He saw some of himself when he was that age in the young man. He was focused, determined, and hopeful. But it was more than just that. He felt the grief of not being able to have children of his own. He admired the kid and would be proud to call someone like him a son. It was his inability to reproduce that had in part destroyed his previous marriage. But with Cleo it was different. She was accepting, open. She didn't make him feel inferior because he couldn't have kids. He let out a long breath. As they walked back to the mansion, the tension in his shoulders and his entire body released little by little on the breeze that shook the palm leaves. They were on the beach where they'd first reunited the day before. How was that only 24 hours ago? Time seemed to have expanded when all he'd wanted it to do previous to meeting Cleo again was for it to pass, and fast. He paused when they reached the area where they'd found the bottle. She looked at him expectantly. Cleo, today, with you, has been the best in a long time. I'm sorry about everything that happened in the past. But thank you for giving me right now. The bow of her lips lifted as did her gaze. His eyes captured hers. The late-day sunlight caught the flecks of gold in her irises. Cleo was beautiful. Radiant. He wanted not just the present with her but the future too. but he couldn't conceive that, so the best he could do was to lean down and kiss her.
Chapter 9. Cleo. The breeze surrounding Cleo went still. The air rushed from her lungs. Caleb's electric blue eyes searched hers. She felt a pleasant zap in her belly, her limbs, her chest. She lifted slightly onto her toes and her eyes fluttered closed as butterflies took flight inside. Caleb gently pressed his lips to hers. His stubble was slightly rough but sent tingles through her. He caressed her jaw and then cradled it with both hands. She circled her arms around his shoulders and felt like she was floating. Caleb inhaled sharply as the kiss deepened. His hand skimmed her back, prompting her to move closer. Her heart thundered against her ribs and she could feel his pounding just as fast. It was so much like the last time they'd kissed and yet new all over again. Cleo smoothed her hand over his arms, feeling the firm muscles underneath his sleeves. Her cheeks flushed as the kiss continued, melting the tension between them and transforming it into happiness, at least for Cleo. By the sound of Caleb's ragged breath, he was enjoying it too. They'd only been back together for a day, but it felt like a decade. It filled her with hope and joy, and love. She continued to kiss him, desperate for 24 more hours to turn into another decade together. When Cleo and Caleb pulled apart, they linked hands and walked inside. But it wasn't a walk exactly. It was more like Cleo was gliding on clouds made of white sand, spun taffy, and warmth that she never wanted to give up. The kiss had made her wonder if she wanted a summer fling with him after all. What if she wanted more? What if she wanted a future with him? Yes. The answer was yes. A dismal what if came next. What if he rejected her all over again? What if he took off? "Will you stay a bit longer?" Caleb asked as they stood in the foyer. The question shook her from her thoughts. Confirmed what her heart longed for. She was typically bold and spoke her mind. It was the obvious shortcut to avoid confusion and misunderstandings. But the words were slow to come. What does this mean? This between us? She had to know. She didn't want to let her heart down again. He still held her hand and squeezed it then. "I'm not sure, Cleo. Can we see what happens? Have our summer adventure together? Find some treasure and then take it from there." Her slow nod turned into a smile. Not exactly what she'd wanted to hear, but it was a start. "See you in the morning." He leaned in, kissed her on the cheek, and left her with the scent of aftershave, sea salt, and sunblock, along with the lingering desire that she did indeed want something more. Up in her room, she showered and changed into a breezy white nightgown with lovely lace eyelets and embroidery. The saleswoman at the store in town must have known she'd need something to sleep in. As Cleo thanked God for her many blessings, she felt certain that she wasn't wrong to pray for Caleb. Something had happened that shook him up. He was typically very present, peaceful. But since their reunion, he occasionally seemed preoccupied or like something was trying to pry its way from the tip of his tongue and he was trying to find the courage to say it. She couldn't fathom what it was but trusted he'd tell her when he was ready. That evening marked Cleo and Caleb's second kiss and not the last. As the next week passed, they shared kisses in the morning over glasses of light and sweets, during picnics, and afternoons spent searching out clues related to the letter and map. They repeatedly came up against dead ends, but Cleo never felt so alive. There was a saying that went along the lines of "Don't count your blessing, be a blessing." That was the life she wanted to live, and she felt its potential with Caleb. She had big dreams of expanding her marketplace for fair trade artisans, for doing more service mission work, for helping those less financially fortunate than she. In the coming days, Cleo checked in with her sisters. She intended to only give them a quick recap of what she was doing and a general location, but couldn't help herself and dished her happy reunion with Caleb, their discovery of the message in the bottle, and a quaint town she felt tempted to call home. As 2 weeks turned into 3, Caleb and Cleo continued their daily habit of taking walks into town and along the beach, while continuing to search for clues. It was almost like they were on vacation. Having breakfast al fresco on the patio at the mansion by morning and watching the sunset with a cold beverage in the evenings was delightful. They'd gone to church several times and out to brunch afterward. It was pure ease. Relaxation. But Cleo sensed that Caleb's external cool didn't reflect some kind of inner turmoil. He repeatedly checked his watch throughout the day, and if he happened to see the time a few minutes shy of noon, he seemed to go far away in his mind. Caleb didn't have a cell phone that she knew of, so she wasn't suspicious that he was waiting for a call from someone like Mandalicious, as had happened at the wedding. Brian had called Cleo several times, but she repeatedly ignored him. It was odd that Caleb didn't have a phone, but his job was high pressure and likely he needed to disconnect fully. Maybe even reconnect with himself. With nature. With peace. There was no doubt the man had worked hard, and she imagined he was burned out. She wanted to give him space and not pressure him more with questions about his personal situation or their status, but the questions loomed, threatening to slip from her mouth. Also, doubt worked its way into the crevices of her mind. Was he still afraid that he was too old for her? Did she not adequately reassure him that it wasn't a problem that he couldn't conceive children? Or was her recent wedding fail too recent for him to feel comfortable about them being together? That afternoon, they sat in the study with every book on the history of Florida and the Spanish Main spread out before them. They still couldn't figure out the clues. The letters didn't make any sense. The arrow that was part of the compass rose pointed at nothing but wide-open sea. Caleb, Cleo started. It was getting harder and harder to restrain her burning questions. He glanced up over his glasses, meeting her gaze with his electric blue eyes. Eyes that sent a charge through her. I have a question. What do you want in a partner? Just that. Just what? She repeated. A partner. Someone to share a life with. I don't believe there's such a thing as an even 50 split, but a mutual give and take, reciprocity. He licked his lips slightly. Also someone with a beautiful smile. A generous heart. Faith. A woman I can trust. Who, he cleared his throat. Who understands me and who lets me love her. Little flares of hope that she could be that for him and more, lit under her skin. Caleb leaned close. Cleo, I want you to understand something. It was always you. You were the one for me. His lips found hers and once more they kissed. She leaned in. His fingers twined in her hair, pulling her closer. She melted against him. It was as perfect as the first time their mouths had met and the second time, and she'd lost count. But each kiss was special. Magical. Magnificent. Cleo Jane Carson loved Caleb, and she wanted him to know it. But his lips were on hers, keeping the words inside. By the weekend, they'd taken to playing games of Scrabble, hoping that would assist them in figuring out what the random letters meant. Lubes. They rearranged them in every possible configuration but didn't come up with anything that made sense. It was late August and Cleo remembered something very important from the summer she'd spent with Caleb in the Dominican Republic. She woke up early the next day and went to the study in the mansion and wrote out 5 clues that would lead Caleb to his birthday gift. She'd like to give him a tangible gift, but she was his house guest and didn't even have her wallet with her. It felt strange to be so untethered, but also a bit wild, free. It was like it had been in The Doctor. She answered to Caleb then, and she answered to him now. Well, in a more reciprocal kind of way. She hid the scavenger hunt clues around the house and thought it was a cute parallel to their treasure hunt. She also cut up fruit and made them parfaits for breakfast. Caleb showered after his workout and came downstairs with a smile. Someone's up early. She threw herself into his arms and squeezed tight. And someone is the birthday boy. His jaw went slack. You remembered? Would never forget. Cleo rubbed her hands together and bounced a little on her toes. And I have a little surprise for you, but you'll have to follow these clues to get your present. She passed him the first note and winked. Caleb's lips quirked, and he spent the next 10 minutes trouncing around the house, following her clues before winding up on the back patio overlooking the garden where she'd set out their breakfast and a vase with some fresh flowers. Happy 40th birthday, she said, and then proceeded to shower him with 40 kisses. That was his present. Her affection. Her love. He scooped her into his arms. What did I do to deserve you? A wide smile spread on Cleo's face. Do you have any special requests for today? A walk? Beach? I'd offer to rent bikes and take a long ride or go out on a boat, but I don't even have my wallet. I like the sound of both. A bike ride might be nice. It looks like it'll be a beautiful day. They'd decided. They rented a pair of beach cruisers in town and followed the trails that laced the area, going inland away along a creek and then back toward the seashore. After several hours, they'd worked up an appetite and wound up at the Coconut Cove restaurant. Remember, Betty said the pie here is amazing. I say you treat yourself to a slice for your birthday. I say I treat you. Betty had appeared with 2 menus and was wearing the restaurant's t-shirt. Cleo didn't realize she worked there too. Birthdays around here are special events. Betty started clapping, portending what was likely a restaurant-wide birthday song to come. Caleb mock-grimaced but played along. They sat on the outdoor deck that was at the end of the dock over the water. The sun hadn't set, but the sky was vibrant shades of yellow and rose. How have you been, Betty? Cleo asked after the older woman took their order. I'm fine, but Gus hasn't been feeling well lately. He'd been fishing a lot down by where the creek drains into the ocean. I don't imagine that the water is too fresh. I keep telling him to see a doctor, but he's stubborn. Cleo and Caleb had met her husband several times. He resembled a bulldog and was the kind of person who seemed indestructible. Caleb lifted his head sharply. I'm a cardiac surgeon. General practice before that. Maybe I can have a chat with him. Can't diagnose or treat, mind you, for legal reasons, but maybe I can point him in the right direction, he offered. Betty lit up. Would you, dear? That would be wonderful. It was the first time Caleb had really acknowledged his profession. His offer was generous and kind. It was another thing that confirmed that he was the man for her. Betty left them to their appetizers and meal. When it came time for dessert, she appeared with an entire key lime coconut cream pie and an entourage. Everyone sang happy birthday. Caleb was slightly shy about it, but also seemed genuinely touched. It was such an amazing community. She truly never wanted to leave Blue Bay Beach. After the song was over, Betty introduced Cleo and Caleb to the restaurant owner Billy and her husband Rhodes, along with Carter, who had played live guitar, while they sang, and his wife Claudia. There was also Isley, Ford, and their daughter Coco of the famed Coco's Cones, where Cleo got ice cream at least 3 times a week but had never formally met the owners. Chevy, Tucker, Ruby, and Trent also wished Caleb a happy birthday and many returns. By then, he was beaming. So was Cleo. Everyone was chattering as they ate pie. Oh, you've ruined me, Betty, Cleo overheard Caleb say. I'll be here every day begging for a slice. I knew you'd like it, Betty said with a laugh. No one escapes Blue Bay Beach without falling in love with the pie, Billy said. Everyone laughed. And Cleo was in love. She was in love with the town, the weather, and Caleb. By the look he gave her, sending a sizzle right to her heart, he was in love with her too.
Chapter 10. Caleb. As the evening lengthened, the twinkle lights surrounding the deck came on and the tiki torches blazed to life. Cleo and Caleb shared the treasure hunt mystery with everyone gathered. The soft light highlighted Cleo's features. He loved to see her tilt her head back in laughter, smile at a comment someone made, and lean in with curiosity as everyone shared their thoughts about the message in the bottle. The secret was no longer theirs, but she was, or at least he wanted to make her his. But the truth he'd tried to escape when he'd left medicine had trailed him to Blue Bay Beach, and he knew there was no way she'd forgive him. He could hardly look himself in the eyes. He couldn't imagine how she'd react. The guests at the restaurant dwindled as the evening wore on. Pulling up empty chairs, Betty and the others sat with them for a few minutes discussing the treasure. The young man, Caleb, at Auntie M's candy shop mentioned something about the sand turning gold, Cleo mentioned offhandedly. There was so much chatter and excitement about the treasure, her voice was lost in the cacophony. Betty got up from her chair and said, "Well, I ought to go check on poor Gus. I'll bring him a slice of pie. I just baked a batch of cowboy cookies. I'll bring some by tomorrow," Chevy said. "Ice cream from Coco's the next day," Isley added. Betty laughed. "He's ornery when he's not feeling himself, but I bet he'd like those treats. Maybe stick around and tell him a story when you drop them off. He gets bored when he's not up to tinkering around in the garage. And thank you, girls." She pushed her chair out and then braced herself on it. "Are you okay?" Caleb asked, moving to get to his feet. Betty put her hand up. "Oh, I'm just fine." It was something Cleo said earlier about the sand turning gold. She leaned toward the most beautiful woman Caleb had ever seen. He could hardly look at Cleo without drowning in her beauty. "No," a little voice in his head said. "You're drowning in the secret you're keeping. Tell her." He couldn't. At least not then. "Cleo, what was that you said about Auntie M saying something about golden sands?" Betty asked. She repeated what they'd heard from young Caleb. Betty dropped into her seat. Everyone leaned in, curious, intent to hear what she had to say. "I knew Auntie M well enough. Everyone in Blue Bay Beach knows each other. That's a fact. If you're a hermit or the kind of person that wants to keep to yourself, I say, move along. You won't make it in this town," she said with a laugh. A story my grandmother told suddenly came back to me. By the wide eyes of everyone at the tables, they were all dying to hear what she had to say about Auntie M and her grandmother's story. "Betty, out with it," Billy said affectionately. She leaned toward Caleb. "She's known for telling long stories and going off on tangents." "I heard that," Betty said. "And I always come back around to my point. Which is that long ago a ship sailed over the land from the Atlantic here to the Gulf." "Over the land? The Florable?" Caleb asked. "I reckon so. But my grandfather would butt into the story to say the ship used rivers and other waterways to come across. But at some point, it ran aground. Afraid the treasure would be stolen, the captain buried it." "The treasure?" Cleo asked. Betty shook her head. "No, the whole ship. Why didn't the captain just sail in the sea around the tip of Florida? Everyone thought it was wrecked. Probably didn't want to get found out or caught. Or worse, raided by pirates." "Louis, that old son of a gun," Caleb said. Everyone laughed. "So what you're saying is that maybe the ship with the treasure is buried somewhere inland?" Cleo asked. "That's the story. That day the sand turned to gold. Legend has it that the gold from the ship somehow bled from its hiding place and into the creek, then dried up on the sand when the tide went out. When the tide came back in, it washed away." Everyone was rapt by the story. Caleb and Cleo had walked and rode bikes to where a creek from inland washed in the ocean up the coast a ways. When the tide was out, they could cross and keep walking along the beach. When the tide came in, the freshwater and saltwater mixed, forming a pool. It was also good for fishing as saltwater fish waited around for the freshwater fish to fill in with the incoming tide. Do you think that's what Hernando Oliver, the founder of the town, meant? On the plaque under the statue, it says, Blue Bay Beach is believed to be a place glittering with gold for those who know how to look for treasure. Caleb asked. Could very well be, Betty said. She said good night. Carter and Claudia offered to walk her home and the three of them left. Billy had to get back to work and said, stay as long as you like and make sure to fill me in if you figure out anything. She kissed Rhodes on the cheek. We'd better get this little munchkin home, Isley said, scooping a sleepy Coco up. Ford pushed in their chairs, saying good night to everyone. That left Rhodes, Tucker, Chevy, Trent, and Ruby at the table. That's something. Imagine if a ship is buried somewhere over there, Trent said, gesturing to the land behind them. I imagine plenty of people have gone in search of it, Chevy added. I don't recall Sandy ever saying anything about it, Ruby said, referring to the late and beloved namesake for the Sandy Shore Inn. What were the other clues? Rhodes asked. Cleo and Caleb showed everyone the letter with the faint map, reiterated what they'd read about Luis Alejandro Ruiz and added what Betty told them. There was also the compass rose in the candy store and lastly the golden letters. We don't know for sure those are clues, but the statue of Hernando points to the candy store and the compass rose points that way, Cleo said. Everyone gazed into the distance. It was dark by then and the plump moon sparkled on the water. There's nothing there, Chevy said. Tucker scratched the scruff on his chin. Gus took me out fishing a few times. Said when the tide is right, there are little islands that appear. More like sandbars really, but he said when he was a kid, they'd go out and explore. But the tide has to be low. Very low. Usually when the moon is full. I'll have to ask him. I'm going to head over tomorrow and see how he's doing, Caleb said. I can ask then. I hope he's okay, Chevy said. I don't suppose we're any closer to cracking this, but thank you all for your insight, Caleb said as he got up. He pulled out Cleo's chair, helping her to her feet. Thanks for having a birthday, man, Tucker said, clapping Caleb on the shoulder. Thanks for celebrating with me, mate, Caleb said in his Australian accent. Rhodes shook his hand. If getting older means I get to have a slice of that pie once a year, then I'm all for aging, Caleb said. Everyone laughed. The women said good night. Caleb placed his hand low on Cleo's back and guided her from the restaurant. Thanks for the surprise birthday, he said when they reached the end of the dock. He cupped her cheek in his hand and leaned in for a kiss. She was soft and warm and everything he wanted. When they parted, she said, oh, and I'm going to get you to have another piece of pie before your 41st birthday. Why is that? Because it's delicious. Because you deserve it. Because I don't want to feel guilty about having a slice a day, Cleo said around a laugh and pulled him along. I wouldn't criticize you if you wanted to eat a slice of pie a day. I'm sure I could find some medical study or other that supports pie eating benefits. Let's see. The cream has calcium. The limes contain vitamin C. Don't forget about vitamin H, Cleo said. There's no such vitamin. Sure there is. Vitamin H for happiness. Cleo giggled. That's very important to a person's well-being and I don't even need to reference the literature. She poked him in the side, teasing. Fair enough, he said with a laugh. Caleb caught her hand in his and they strolled along the street and back toward Mansion Mile. Cleo loved Blue Bay Beach, that much was clear. He liked it too and was definitely not a hermit. Well, not in real life. Then what had he been doing, hiding away? You know what else contains high levels of vitamin H? Cleo asked, breaking him from his thoughts. HMM. Puppies, kittens, lazy beach days, sunshine. He paused but before he could talk himself out of it and keep his guard up, he said, and you, Cleo. You make me very happy. She giggled again. That's what I was going to say. That you make me happy. Hearing her say that sent a little jolt through him. But the secret he held revolted, trying to tear him away from happiness. He fought back, and with a mock-serious newscaster voice, he said, this just breaking, new reports from the medical community suggest spending time with one Cleo Jane Carson with her abundance of vitamin H brings smiles, laughter, and joy into lives. It can't be bottled or sold, but it's an essential daily nutrient all the same. She laughed again, and they were soon inside the mansion. Standing in the foyer, Cleo lifted onto her toes and laced her arms around Caleb's neck. I guess this is good night. Happy birthday. Her lips brushed his. He melted inside as he slung his arms around her waist, drawing her closer. He'd dreamed of kissing her again, ever since they'd first done so in the Dominican Republic. When they finally did, it was everything he'd hoped for and more. There was her soft sweetness, her vanilla cream scent. Even though he didn't have much of a sweet tooth, he wasn't immune. Forget about air, he could breathe her in forever. As the kiss deepened, the embers in his chest glowed to life, creating a fire inside that nothing other than Cleo could squelch. He loved her. Didn't want to lose her. But instead of thinking of the inevitability, he reminded himself to stay in the moment. They continued to kiss, and it was the best birthday gift he'd ever received. When she finally lowered onto her feet, she said, I want to find the treasure, but I'm afraid that when we do, this will be over. A pang pressed against his chest. She must have sensed he was hiding something. He was surprised she didn't know. But that was the whole point. To keep the situation a secret. That was why he'd stopped returning her calls and letters all those years ago. He'd had a difficult choice to make. He never doubted he'd made the right one but was given a second chance with her and was so grateful. Caleb brushed his thumb across her cheek. We can't stay here forever, he said. Her shoulders dropped an inch, but then she pressed them back. He'd left her once. Of course, she feared it could happen again. It wasn't what he wanted, but he was certain this time she'd be the one doing the leaving. How could she not? What he did was unforgivable. Caleb kissed her once more on the cheek and watched her slowly pad up the stairs to the guest room. He loved everything about Cleo but hated the sight of her back because he'd soon be seeing it again, and she'd be right. It would be over.
Chapter 11. Cleo. The next day, Cleo and Caleb went to Egret Avenue where Betty and Gus lived. She was at the library, but he answered the door and invited them in. After greetings, introductions, and small talk, Gus said, Betty came home last night all a-twitter about that treasure. Make any headway? Tucker from next door mentioned that when you guys went fishing, you told him about some small islands off the coast that appear when the tide is low. Gus smiled. Sure are. Haven't gone out when the tide is right in ages, but when I was a kid we lived for those days. We'd track the tides, waiting for the lowest one, and go exploring. Once, we even went out at night. Rumor had it, there was treasure buried there. Cleo pulled out the message from the bottle. For many years over the sea, I have sailed. I sought that which cannot be bought or sold. A great many folk has sought riches and gold. My treasure will not leave you lonely or cold. Whosoever finds this booty will be blessed with fortunes untold. But know that abundance and prosperity favor the bold. The greatest wealth of knowledge comes from the old. I am the pirate who broke the mold. Signed. After she translated it, Gus said, Well, I'll be. This is something. We think it could be from Luis Alejandro Ruiz, the pirate. We grew up hearing about pirates, but Barbaroja aka Red Beard wasn't among those that were feared. He was a Robin Hood type pirate. Robbing from the rich and giving to the poor. Though most famously, he buried the Floribel treasure. Any ideas what it could be or where? Gus pressed his hand against his stomach and shook his head. Nothing comes to mind. Do you remember any of the stories about the supposed treasure? Betty had a few about the golden sands. Oh, that old tale. There are as many stories as the day is long. And even more, if you wait for nightfall. But unlike Betty, I don't put much stock in them. Back in the day, people had to make stuff up to keep each other entertained. Cleo could tell that Caleb appreciated his pragmatism. Doubt dampened her excitement. Maybe the message in the bottle was something a bunch of kids did for laughs. Nonetheless, she went on to tell him about the founder's statue, the candy shop, and the compass. My great-grandpappy was the mason who tiled that floor. You see, Auntie M's real name was Mabel Redding. The Redding family owned that land where the candy shop now sits. It was open space long at the time, but they wanted to provide the townsfolk with a general store. The problem was, the property contained a magnificent, massive compass made of marble and supposedly some real gold. It was right there in the ground. They debated what to do. They decided they'd simply reconstruct the compass inside the store. You see, laws about construction and preservation were different back then. Some of the locals squawked in complaint, I'm sure, but they went ahead with it. Gus winced. She worried about him but knew Caleb would be able to help. Do you suppose the treasure is underneath the compass, well, the original compass? Kind of like an X marks the spot. Cleo asked. Caleb rested his chin on his hand. No, remember, it's pointing to something. The islands? Cleo asked. Then she added, when we were inside Auntie M's, there were some letters on signs printed in gold. We've been trying to figure out if they mean anything. Caleb took out the piece of paper where they'd written "bays" and tried to unscramble it. Betty gets me puzzle books to keep my mind sharp. Let's see. "Bays." As he folded forward, he gripped his stomach. Can I get anything for you? Cleo asked. No, it's just this darned pain I've been having. Like I told Betty, I've had a stomach ache and it's radiated over to the side. I'm retired now and started spending a considerable amount of time fishing down by where the creek drains into the ocean, just as I've been doing since I was a boy. But that's when it started. Do you eat your catch? Caleb asked. Sure do. Nothing wasted. Any fever, headache, fatigue? No fever, but yes to the other symptoms. I just don't feel myself. Caleb gazed out the window in thought for a moment. Cleo admired the silhouette of his firm jaw, the line of his nose, and knowing eyes. She also revered his knowledge as a doctor and dedication to his practice. He wanted to help people. Shame was, it seemed like he needed some help. He hadn't yet said why he was in Blue Bay Beach, but she'd ask him again. She was there for him if he needed to talk. Goodness knows he'd listened to her rant about Brian and her failed wedding enough. Caleb wrote down some recommended tests for Gus to get that related to dirty water and heavy metal exposure, which could happen if he'd consumed certain kinds of fish. Bring this to your general practitioner and tell them what you said to me. Gus read the note. You think I might have some kind of poisoning? Caleb said, could be. Some types of fish contain high levels of heavy metals that can result in toxicity. It's been known to happen. It could be something in the water. No way to know until you get these blood tests. He pointed to the paper. I'll do as you say, Doc, but begrudgingly. The nearest doctor's office is almost 30 miles away. Too far if you ask me. I hope you feel better fast. Please come to me if you need anything at all, if you have questions, or if I can help in some way. By the tone of Caleb's voice, it seemed like it felt good for him to say those words after having been away from his practice for almost a month. To do what he was put on earth to do. To help people heal. Gus's comment gave Cleo an idea. She wondered if Caleb would ever consider leaving surgery and returning to general practice, and opening up a small office in Blue Bay Beach. She'd have to ask him later. Just as they were about to leave, Caleb turned and asked, by any chance do those little islands you mentioned have names? His question prompted Cleo to recall the old map in the library. Oh sure, there was La Isla Ora, La Isla Corazon, and La Isla Isabel. That's Gold Island, Heart Island, and Isabel Island. Of course, they both were fluent in Spanish and knew that, but realization dawned. Caleb held the message and the paper with the letters LBAs printed on it. He glanced down and his eyes widened. Cleo's did too. Gus, you're a genius. Rearrange these letters and you get Isabel. Get yourself to the doctor ASAP and then call me, Caleb said as they both took off running down Egret Avenue. Cleo waved goodbye over her shoulder. They were both giddy with excitement over the discovery. When they reached the library, Betty was inside. They were both nearly out of breath and filled her in on the chat with Gus, Caleb's suspicions about his health, and their discovery. The three of them went over to survey the map. Now we need to know the tides, rent a boat, and find the right island, Caleb said. Betty held up a finger. Hang on. Gus gets on my back about it, but I save everything. You never know when you might need it. We've seen a fair number of our loved ones leave this earth and return home to God, but that doesn't mean they're forgotten. I keep a record of their lives. The library was small, and they followed her to a back room packed with boxes. I don't get too many patrons, so I have plenty of time on my hands. Gus has his garage and I have my projects here. I don't know if this is common in your generation, but in mine, we kept journals, made scrapbooks, and held on to news clippings. We didn't have devices where you could find out just about anything with the click of a button. Don't get me wrong, they have their place, but you won't find any of this, she gestured around the room, in there. Betty pointed at Cleo's phone which she held in her hand. These boxes contain the personal history of regular people like you and me. Dreams, desires, heartbreak. No, it's not necessarily the stuff you'd ordinarily find in a library, but that doesn't make it matter any less. Now, let me see. She shuffled around several boxes labeled with names and dates. Glancing around, there was so much history in that room, Cleo could practically hear the voices of the past. Love won and lost, children born and families created. Her nose twitched and her eyes felt scratchy, whether from the dust or something else, she wasn't sure. Aha! Betty said at last. Here it is. My father did this drawing when he was a young boy. He labeled the 3 islands, see? Betty showed them a rough sketch on yellowed paper. He said the best fishing was off Isla Ora. But you'd find plenty of snails on Isla Corazon. Cleo took a photo with her phone. And the treasure? Could it be on Isla Isabel? Betty nodded. I'd imagine so. After all, Isabel was Luis Alejandro Ruiz's great love. Inspired, they went to the map on the wall by the old photographs and copied down the coordinates. After thanking Betty, they hurried to Reef Rentals to inquire about the tides and renting a boat. Cleo waited outside, bouncing with excitement. Don't forget, we'll need a shovel too. Caleb went inside to conduct the transaction. Cleo would have needed her wallet with her ID and money in the very least. She knew she had to return to her life soon, though she had scheduled the month off for her honeymoon. Her excitement faded slightly at the reminder of that mega failure. She wanted to give Brian a piece of her mind but had to wonder if it was worth it. Still, she soon had to leave the bubble of Blue Bay Beach and return to reality. Whatever that was. But would Caleb be a part of it? With her entire heart, she hoped so. He appeared and gave her the thumbs up. The tide will be low this afternoon. He checked his watch and then stiffened. Shaking his head slightly, he found his smile. There is a boat available. It's small but we'll get the job done. The treasure will be ours. Caleb intoned the word "our" to sound like pirate speak for ours. She giggled. That's the spirit. After lunch at the snack shack up the beach, the Reef Rentals employee instructed them on boat safety and then passed over the key. Soon, they were in a little outboard rig with a metal hull. The water was placid, the sun was high, and Caleb was captain. Over the boat engine, Cleo called, "If you were a pirate, what would your name be?" Caleb's laugh seemed forced. "Jolly Roger?" "No, Whitebeard. You only have a few white hairs and I think they're handsome." "You do?" "Well, in that case, should I come upon a fair maiden dressed in a gown on the beach, she will be sure to win my favor." His voice strained, but it could have been because of the wind. Cleo giggled. Soon, the land behind them shrunk. She consulted the compass on her phone for the coordinates. Instructing Caleb where to go, they soon came upon 3 sandy bumps in the otherwise flat and pristine blue water. Caleb let off the throttle. "Not much island to speak of. Remember, Tucker said the tide has to be very low, but that one is Isla Isabel. I think there's enough ground to work with." They dropped the small anchor and waded into the shallows. Little fish darted away. Cleo imagined an impressive ship flying a Jolly Roger in the distance. "It's amazing out here. So peaceful." Caleb squinted into the distance. "I don't like the look of those clouds." "In that case, let's get digging." While doing so, Cleo thought about the note from Luis Alejandro Ruiz, which she now had memorized. "For many years over the sea, I have sailed. I sought that which cannot be bought or sold. A great many folk has sought riches and gold. My treasure will not leave you lonely or cold. Whosoever finds this booty will be blessed with fortunes untold. But know that abundance and prosperity favor the bold. The greatest wealth of knowledge comes from the old. I am the pirate who broke the mold." "I wonder what the treasure could be," Cleo said. "If we find it," Caleb answered with a grunt. Ever since he'd checked his watch, he seemed preoccupied. Slightly distant. Then again, maybe boating was outside his comfort zone. Or perhaps the gathering clouds had him worried. They spread out the circumference where they dug. Considering only part of the island was above the surface, the treasure could be anywhere. They were distancing physically as they dug, but it also felt like they were distancing emotionally. He'd been so quiet. So wrapped in his thoughts. Doubt sunk in Cleo's stomach. She worried the end of the summer would be no different from the other one they'd spent together. He'd left her once. What was to stop him from leaving again? In terms of returning to New York, she was worried about things with her mother mostly, what she was going to do when she left Blue Bay Beach, and how things would turn out with Caleb. There was so much uncertainty. They dug in silence as the sun disappeared behind clouds. It was starting to look like they weren't going to find the treasure after all. If nothing else, it had been a fun distraction. But Cleo didn't want Caleb or the treasure or her life for the past month to be only a summer memory. She wanted more of it. And why not? Before she could answer the question, the rhythmic sound of Caleb's shovel hitting wet sand and then it scattering behind him made a thud. She stopped digging and looked up. His eyes were especially blue, surrounded by sea and sky, but they were clouded too. "We'd better hurry up because it seems like a storm is coming, but my shovel hit something hard. Probably a rock or a shell." "We'll see about that, matey," she said in a pirate voice and continued to dig. Sure enough, something solid slowly appeared from the sand. Together, they hauled out a wooden chest bolstered by metal straps and fastened with metal bolts. A rusty lock hung from the closure. The chest was slightly bigger than a picnic basket and not overly heavy. Cleo and Caleb made sounds of awe as thunder cracked. "We'd better go," Caleb said, making for the boat with the chest under his arm. Cleo got in and with a glance back at Isla Isabel, they hightailed it back to the mainland.
Chapter 12. Caleb. Caleb had gone boating as a kid. It was one of a handful of memories he had of his father before he took off on his wife and son. The last time he'd boated was with his mentor, though it was of the yachting variety. He didn't expect the impact being on the water would have on him. It was like the proximity of the salt in the water was drawing his sadness out of him. Before, he was battling his emotions. Now, they were trying to outrun a storm. Lightning cracked and thunder rumbled. The sky was a purple bruise and the wind chop on the water was almost too much for the tiny boat. Cleo focused on the land and the breeze blew her hair away from her face as her gaze sharpened. He wanted to explain. He had to explain. But first, he wanted to complete their treasure hunting mission. Then he'd have to say goodbye. As Caleb docked the boat, fat raindrops started to fall, drenching them. He had a car back at the mansion, but walking around Blue Bay Beach was far easier. They'd just have to wait out the weather before heading back to the house. Cleo was nearly shivering from the wind and wet. She said, "Do you think Betty is still at the library? We could bring the chest there. It's closer than the house." Carrying the chest, they hurried to the library, but it was closed. Maybe she brought Gus to the doctor's office for those tests. "I guess we'd better just make the schlep to the house," Cleo said. It was like they were both dragging their feet, prolonging the inevitable. After they opened the treasure chest, the quest would be over and so would their summer fling. By the time they got back to the house, they were both soaked through. Leaving the chest on the kitchen island, they both went to their rooms to freshen up. When Cleo reappeared, she wore loose pants and a Blue Bay Beach sweatshirt, more garb from the shop in town. His hair was still damp as he made them both warm tea. "Would you like to do the honors?" he asked, gesturing to the chest. "I think we should document this since Betty and the others aren't here. They're part of this too." She turned on her phone and started recording, adding narration. Caleb used a set of pliers to remove the lock and then carefully lifted the lid. He figured it would be empty or filled with sand. Instead, it contained 12 glass bottles in a variety of colors and topped with corks. They were all in decent condition. Cleaner than the one they'd found washed up on the shore. Cleo peered inside. "Caleb, I think there are messages inside each one." Again, he carefully removed a bottle. Sure enough, she was right. As before, he pulled out the rolled-up piece of paper and uncurled it. Cleo hovered her camera over the letter and then turned off her phone. "We can get the rest later." Her voice was little more than a whisper. Across the top of the first letter were the words "Mi querida amor." "My dear love," Cleo read. Written in Spanish, the rest was a love letter to Isabel. Luis Alejandro Ruiz professed his affections, how much he missed her, and promises for their future together. The other letters followed suit, each addressing her with similar terms of endearment. "Mi corazón, mi vida, and mi carina." Cleo read, "My heart, my life, my dear." She had tears in her eyes when she said, "Isabel never received these." He buried them. He must have known he'd never be able to return to her. Caleb rubbed her back just as he'd done when they'd met on the beach all those weeks ago. Touching her felt right, and he wanted more, but like Luis, he'd soon be leaving his love. Caleb's brow furrowed. "This certainly wasn't what I was expecting. This is something for a museum or to return to Isabel's family in Spain. Betty can help us. She has half of South Florida's history in that little library. She'll know what to do." Cleo turned to him then. He saw the question in her gaze before she spoke. "But what about our history? What about our future?" He scrubbed his hand down his face. The time had come. But where to start? Cleo was the brave one. The bold one. She spoke first. "After that summer together, our phone calls turned into texts that turned into emails that turned into silence. Caleb, I didn't wallow." Her tone suggested that indeed she had. Guilt pierced him. He hadn't meant to hurt her. "Okay, maybe for one night I polished off a pint of ice cream and a bowl of popcorn with extra butter and binged Hallmark movies on Netflix. Fine, I didn't leave the house for the entire weekend. But then I picked right up and got back to work. I told myself to take the summer fling for what it was and let it go." Her jaw twitched as though she'd traveled back in time to the pain of losing him. Caleb had to find the words to tell her why he'd disappeared. "I had dreams, faith, and a future. I wasn't going to let heartbreak stop me. But I was going to get married as soon as possible. Whatever it took." 10 years later, that was a big, fat fail. But all through that period, I braided my time with you into the fiber of my being. Rarely did a day pass that I didn't think of you. But I never thought I'd see you again. I hoped, but never expected it. Her vulnerability lent him courage. All those years ago, all along, I knew you were the one. I'd already planned my proposal. Envisioned our wedding and future. But it's true. I had trepidation about our age difference. But it's only 7 years. If we're meant for each other, numbers don't matter. They matter to some people. It was like he'd slapped her across the face. That came out wrong. What really happened, Caleb? She knew there was more. She had to. There was no way she didn't detect that he had a secret. I was at a different phase of my life, he said, speaking to the age difference and what he had yet to say. That sounds like an objection rather than a reason. I wanted you, Caleb, and a family, kids, with you. I didn't find out that I couldn't be a dad until later. Just because we can't conceive, doesn't mean you can't be a father. The word father made him feel like she'd slapped him back. It was so loaded. So close to the truth. He drew a deep breath. He had to do it. Pull the bandage off style. When we were still in the DR, I was thinking a lot about the shape the future would take. I considered opening my own small practice so I could continue to help people more directly. In fact, it had been a dream of mine. The corner of Cleo's lip lifted. Blue Bay Beach could use a Dr. Robinson, she said. He couldn't bring a smile to his lips in return. It was too close to being over with her. I was offered the prestigious internship that would guarantee a different path for me, taking me outside general practice. That took you on the surgery track. He nodded. It was at the premier facility in the world for cardiac health. Cleo's expression flashed. Likely, they were thinking about the same person. The Carson Center, he said. Her fingers pressed against her lips. Those 3 words told her enough. Tears welled. He gripped her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. He'd already had her eyes memorized but took a snapshot in his mind so he'd never forget.
I went in for the preliminary interview. The follow-up. The 3rd and 4th rounds. I'd made it. William Carson himself, your father, offered me the position. I'd have been a fool to turn it down. But I figured we could make a long-distance relationship work. Or maybe you could get a place in North Carolina and we could still see each other.
Get married. Everything you said. Her forehead formed ripples. She still didn't understand. Each word spoken brought him closer and closer to the painful truth. Soon, she'd hate him. There was a framed photograph on Dr. Carson's desk. 3 girls. Each beautiful. One especially so with auburn hair. Green eyes. My own eyes must have lit up. I told your father that I knew you. That we'd spent the summer together in the DR. That I'd fallen in love with you. She shuddered a breath. He gave me an ultimatum. Stay away from you. Never speak to you again, and the job was mine. The future and everything I'd ever wanted was all within reach. He'd train me himself. Teach me everything he knew. I'd be his protege. Caleb felt disconnected to his voice as he spoke the painful truth. Everything would be yours if you gave me up, Cleo said, guessing correctly. Caleb nodded. If I had to do it all over again, I probably would have chosen differently. But I can't say for sure. The tears in Cleo's eyes were close to spilling over. You saved so many lives. I don't blame you. I just wish I'd known. Why did my father forbid you to see or talk to me though? Why? He'd said, men like us can't get mixed up with marriage. We have to remain focused. We couldn't dedicate ourselves to our careers and a woman. It has to be one or the other. Her head slid slowly from side to side. That's not true. You can make a difference and still have a loving relationship. Just because it didn't work out for him. I know that now. I was foolish back then. Being with you is wonderful. But it also brings me reminders of him. The egg creams, for instance. He had a place he loved in Brooklyn. Mario's, Cleo said. He nodded. Even boating. He loved being out on the water. Cleo brushed her hand along his shoulder. I'm sorry, Caleb. I didn't realize that he was your mentor. You've been grieving. You lost him too. He had to get it out. No, Cleo. I killed him. He expected her to run, but she froze as the words filtered between them. She whispered, "Time of death. 11:59. She understood then. He had to explain. 3 arteries blocked at nearly 100%. The 4th was barely hanging on, 89. He'd been having pains. The cause was so close, right under his nose, but he didn't recognize it. Or ignored it. I don't know. When he had the first recorded heart attack, I read his proxy. It confirmed what he'd told me. I was the surgeon to perform the bypass. Me and no one else. He only trusted me. He said he taught me everything he knew. His hands would guide me. He said, Caleb's voice cracked. He said it would be as if he were performing it on himself. He trusted me, Cleo, and I failed him. Cleo was openly crying and clutching him. He didn't make it, but you. He broke free. Facing her anger and disappointment felt impossible. He turned away. Figured that she'd be the one to leave that time. He'd done it to her. But he didn't imagine it could hurt so much. He regretted leaving her more than anything but understood why she'd do the same. Just then, Cleo's phone rang. She answered. As she went upstairs, he could still hear part of the conversation. It was a male voice, and just before she slipped into the guest room, Caleb heard her say, "Okay, Brian. I'll be there soon." Caleb remained in the foyer. He wasn't sure how much time passed, but Cleo reappeared with her wedding dress filling her arms. So that was it. This is where we say goodbye. And this time I'll add that I'm sorry. His voice was rough. I understand why. He couldn't finish the sentence with "you wouldn't want to be with me." From outside came the sound of a car honking. She must have called a cab. Her face was pained as she whisked outside. Caleb remained in the doorway, watching her leave as the rain continued to pound down. Caleb could have gone back to the warm shelter of the house. Instead, he set off across the street to the beach where he watched the waves crash to shore. They may as well have been slamming into him. He felt torn apart, desperate, lost. He knew it would hurt to see her go, to let her go, but not as much as it did. The pain tore through him, saturating him like the rain. He deserved it though. She deserved better. He couldn't remain out there forever. He couldn't be with her forever. That was what he'd wanted more than anything. The sound of a car honking startled him. Was she back? Did she want to throw sand in his face, pelt him with lashing rain? He probably deserved that too. Up on the road, Betty waved from a small SUV. "Caleb, what are you doing out in this mess?" He didn't know how to answer. Before he could move, Gus was out of the car, guiding him into the back seat. They pulled into the driveway of the mansion and helped him indoors. After getting warmed up and changed again, he felt as if he owed them an explanation. They were in the kitchen. Gus was eating some cantaloupe and Betty had tea. "We made ourselves at home. You didn't have to help me." Gus screwed up his bulldog features. "We most certainly did. You saved my life. Turns out it's lead poisoning. Messed up my kidneys. They said my liver was next. Doc said had I waited any longer I'd be in trouble." The news pulled Caleb from his stupor and he asked about the plan for his care and recovery. The clinical nature of the conversation put distance between himself and what happened with Cleo. Just when he was about to let them know he was fine and they could head home so he could carry on with his wallowing, Betty cut him a glare. "Where is Cleo?" she asked. Caleb hung his head. Betty tapped her nails against the counter. When Gus went back to the fridge for seconds, he had a feeling they weren't going anywhere. The rain continued to pound down, and he figured they were better off waiting it out. His chest was heavy. His heart hurt. He thought of William, his mentor. How his heart had failed. How Caleb had failed him. The entire story spilled out. Gus had polished off the entire globe of fruit and around a mouthful said, "You're telling me this was the guy who trained you? Taught you everything you know? He demanded you do the surgery?" Caleb nodded. "You also maintain that you killed him?" "Gus, dear. This isn't a cross-examination," Betty said. "Since he hasn't been feeling well, he's been watching a lot of courtroom shows." "Well?" Gus asked. What exactly did you do wrong in the surgery? Caleb held his head in his hands. It's a lot to explain. Son, we're both old. Please, give us some credit. We may not be able to perform surgery, but we know how to listen. Caleb drew a deep breath and did his best to explain it in layman's terms. When he was done, both Betty and Gus sat in silence for a few long minutes as though digesting what he'd told them. Betty said, "You followed all the protocols. Did everything to the letter." He nodded. At last, Gus said, "You said that the rate of success was low. But William entrusted me to do it. To pull off the impossible." "You're not God," Betty said. "Only he can perform miracles." "I think William made a bad call asking, no, demanding you do the procedure, Caleb. Had you not, he would have died, anyway. As I see it, you're innocent. You did your best, son." His arteries were beyond repair. Hearing someone who was completely impartial landed the words in a different way than they did when he'd heard them from his colleagues and as they played and warped in his mind since William passed. They were right. But it still hurt. "Come on. I have someone you need to have a word with." Betty walked to the door. The rain slowed to a drizzle as they arrived at the church. They all went in and Caleb sat on a bench and prayed and cried and listened to God for once instead of begging for William to come back. He also prayed that Cleo would someday see it in her heart to forgive him. Afterward, they went back outside. The rain had let up. Arcing over the ocean, a bold rainbow stretched through the sky. It was almost as if it landed on Isla Isabel where he and Cleo had found the treasure chest with the notes. He'd forgotten to tell Betty and Gus the news of their discovery. Standing in the churchyard, he filled them in. The heavy longing for Cleo lifted sometime between then and when he'd been inside the church. He had to talk to her. Gus was right along with the dozens of others that he spoke to before he resigned from his position and the team who did an inquiry after William's death. It had been his idea. There had been other surgeons assisting him during the procedure. Nurses and medical professionals. They all knew he'd done everything he could to save William's life. He wanted to do more. But he was only a man. A man big enough to apologize to Cleo and ask her to forgive him. "I can't wait to see the love notes," Betty said. "They're historical artifacts for sure." Gus rubbed his stomach. "This whole pirate and treasure hunting and the lead poisoning business got me thinking." "You're going to stop eating the fish you catch in the creek," Betty scolded. "You bet. We're also going to find the Florable, but before we do, Caleb's going to get Cleo back," Gus said. He was already hurrying down the street.
Chapter 13. Cleo. Cleo was in such a state of shock when Caleb told her about her father, that when Brian called she was on autopilot. The farther the cab carried her from Blue Bay Beach, the more it felt like she was leaving her heart behind. She thought that Caleb was sending her away again, but really, she'd been the one to leave that time. She'd walked away without an explanation. The more she recalled their conversation, the more she realized that she left because she was afraid that if she didn't he would. He was just feeling guilty about William's death and the ultimatum her father had given him. She couldn't wrap her head around it. The salt and sand-stained wedding gown sat limply on the seat beside her. Her ex-fiancé wanted to talk to her. Explain his side. She figured she ought to let him and experience the satisfaction of telling him exactly why she'd left and then say a final and stern goodbye. There was no excuse for what he'd done. However, she could hardly comprehend what had happened with Caleb. Had the divorce broken her father so much he'd warned Caleb away from her? She'd never have an answer but would call her mother to find out. First, she'd call Brian because as she returned to her senses, he was the last person she wanted to see, never mind talk to. His number rang and rang. He wasn't much of a talk-on-the-phone guy. More of a text and direct message sort. She tried the first with a very blunt "Were you seeing Mandy while we were engaged?" The little bubble, indicating he was replying, blinked. "Yes. Sorry about that. I, kind of freaked out. I don't think I'm the marrying kind of person. Is this what you wanted to discuss?" She typed. "That and just to say I'm sorry things didn't work out," he replied. There. You said it. Thank you for being honest. Good luck with Mandalicious. I wish you the best. He was typing again. We broke up. I'm dating Candy XOXO 533. She didn't have anything to say to that. How had she been such an idiot to think she had a future with him? Thank goodness they didn't have kids. That would have been a disaster. Forget about seeing him again. It was nice of him to get a hold of her to apologize, but there was no need to see him in person. She deleted him from her contacts. Next up, Cleo had to call her mother. Winona answered on the first ring. Young lady, it's about time. Your sisters insisted I give you some time but a month? What on earth have you been doing? Wait. Don't answer that. First, tell me why you left your wedding. Darling, we could have figured out a way to make it work. Her mother instantly got under her skin. Cleo took a deep, centering breath. For a woman who is so big on manners, you sure set a poor example. Young lady, watch yourself. I may be younger than you, but I'm in my 30s. Please, don't scold me. And by way of greeting me, the appropriate thing to have asked would have been something along the lines of "Dear, are you okay, or I've been so worried. How can I help? Or is there anything you need?" Even a simple hello would have sufficed. Winona huffed. I walked out of the wedding because Brian got a call from his mistress during the ceremony. Well, yes, but surely we could have dealt with that. He and I were on the phone earlier. I told him to apologize to you and try to patch things up. The wedding license is still valid. You could go ahead with it still. Mother, Cleo said. He's dating someone named Candy XOXO 533. He does not want to marry me and I do not want to marry him. Why would you want me to? The line was quiet. Mom? Cleo asked. What have you been doing? Winona asked, but there was a tremor in her voice. Please answer my question. Why would you want me to marry Brian? Winona's voice was small when she answered. Because I don't want you to be lonely like I am. Mom, Cleo repeated, more softly. I didn't know. Your father was always gone. Working all the time. I had you girls, but it wasn't the same. I married your father, not Captain Surgery USA. Cleo laughed lightly at the name Winona used to tease her father with. But if I could do it again, I would. Now that he's gone, I'd marry him all over again and figure out a way to make it work. Caleb told me about what happened, Cleo said. She assumed her mother knew. Caleb Robinson? Oh, that poor young man. He took all the blame for your father's death. It wasn't his fault. He ordered a full inquiry because he felt so guilty. I pray every day that he realizes that he's held harmless. Caleb also told me that Dad forbade him to date me. Oh, that. The sound on the line was quiet. You knew, Mom? Uh-huh. I'm sorry. William thought it was for the best. But you knew my heart was broken. To be honest, I also thought you were better off not dating a surgeon. One way or another you would have experienced heartbreak. No pun intended, considering they both worked in the cardiac field. Cleo had to laugh lightly at that. Her mother likely wouldn't change much, but she had. And despite everything, she loved her mother, and to hear she'd been lonely made her sad. You asked before, what have I been doing? I've been falling back in love. I'm in love with Caleb. As they continued to talk, the rain started to let up and a giant rainbow spread across the sky. Cleo hadn't just fallen back in love. She was in love and she wanted Caleb despite the past. She wanted the future with him. Cleo held her hand over the mouthpiece of the phone and asked the cab driver to turn around. "Please bring me back to where you picked me up." She turned back to the call. "Mom, listen. I have a place I'd like you to come visit. I think you'd enjoy Blue Bay Beach." "Oh, where's that?" Curiosity infused Winona's voice. "Where I've been, where I'm going. Where my future is." Cleo was bobbing in her seat by the time the cab reached the sign for Blue Bay Beach. She had to tell Caleb how she felt. He'd referred to Brian as a boy. She'd been immature as well. She'd fled. No honor there. She owed Caleb the truth. If it didn't work out, then at least that would be better than another decade spent wondering what had happened. As they turned the corner, she realized she was no longer afraid. Whatever happened with her and Caleb, she could handle it because she loved him and nothing could change that. When the cab pulled into the driveway, Cleo rushed to the door and knocked rapidly. There was no answer. She tried again. She called Caleb's name. He wasn't answering. She took out her phone, but he didn't have one of those she could call. Well, he probably did, but it was turned off or back in NYC. She started back toward the cab when she spotted a figure seated in the sand on the beach across the street. Cleo bit her lip and gave the cabbie the 1-minute symbol. She went to the beach and sure enough, Caleb was sitting there watching the waves just as she'd been doing earlier that month. Although, he wasn't in a wedding dress. She cleared her throat. I'd offer the cabbie the gown in exchange for the ride, but I don't think he barters." Caleb looked up and his face burst into a smile all the way up to his electric blue eyes. Relief washed through her. He got to his feet and wrapped his arms around Cleo. They spun around and then he set her down. "Can I borrow, like, $50? If you're open to bartering, I'll trade you a long explanation, an apology, and, some kisses." She bit her lip. "No, it's me who owes you the apology." Caleb went into his wallet and gave her the cash. She paid the cabbie. Caleb was waiting in the entry to the house. "Care for something to drink?" he asked. "If it's light and sweet then yes, please." As before, they settled in the kitchen. Caleb cleared his throat. "Cleo, I want to apologize for disappearing on you, for not standing up to your father, for losing him. I forgive you for all of the above. I'm sorry I left earlier without telling you how I felt. I was shocked, confused, and yes, hurt, but I know you didn't kill my dad. It's true, he trusted you, but that also meant you were the right person for the job. If anyone had a shot at performing the procedure correctly, it was you. I felt so guilty for so long." Cleo interrupted. "You have to forgive yourself, Caleb. It only hurts you to not do so." "You're right. I spoke with Betty and Gus, and God. They brought me to the church. I had a come to Jesus moment. I suppose we both had some growing up to do. But I think we were being led to this moment. Together." He took her hand in his. "What if we don't hold back? What if we live right now? We hope. We risk. We dare. We love. We live this adventure together, but we don't even need to go anywhere. We can stay right here." She leaped to her feet and embraced Caleb. "I love Blue Bay Beach and I love you and I never want to leave. It's enough. More than enough." She met his gaze. "Can we be enough? We can be whatever we want to be, but even if I were to write you 12 love notes and bury them at sea, it wouldn't be enough to express the depth of my love for you, Cleo Jane Carson. And I wouldn't want you to bury your love. I want to keep it out in the open. He held her waist with one hand, drawing her close, and smoothed her hair with the other. Cleo, all this time, we've been searching for treasure. But I realize that the real treasure is each other. You know, I have a wedding dress over there, she hinted and pointed to the chair in the foyer. Caleb's lips quirked, picking up on her meaning. There's something I wanted to ask you 10 years ago. He pulled out his wallet, then drew a deep breath before pulling out a shiny, silver ring with a blue Larimar stone in the center. Cleo's mouth fell open. That was the ring I was admiring in the market outside Punta Cana. I bought it for you that day, intending someday to return to the beach where we first met. There, I was going to ask you to be my wife. At the time, it was all I could afford. Cleo squealed with glee. You never took it out of your wallet? Made a few long car rides a bit painful in the old rear. He patted his back right pocket. It's perfect, Caleb. What's more perfect is our love. I love you and want to spend the rest of my life with you, Cleo. Will you please marry me? Sí, she said in Spanish, as she may have done had he asked her as he'd originally planned in the Dominican Republic. Caleb slid the ring on her finger. She lifted onto her toes and he dipped his head. Their eyes caught. Confirmed. Yes, it was love. Love shared. Love forgiven. Love forever. Their lips met. The kiss and their love was a treasure. Epilogue. In the days after Cleo and Caleb separated and then reunited, they, along with Betty, Gus, and their new friends in Blue Bay Beach, went on a pirate-worthy adventure. After the discovery of the message in the bottle and then the love note's treasure on Isla Isabel, paired with Gus's lead poisoning, he had a hunch. A hunch that wouldn't quit, and it drove Betty crazy enough that she decided they ought to pursue it, if for no other reason than to shut him up about the shipwreck on land. As Betty, Gus, Cleo, and Caleb trudged along the trail that ran along the creek and backed against Blue Bay Beach, they all held metal detectors to try to find the Floribel buried somewhere beneath the sandy soil. I know it's here somewhere, Gus called from across the marsh. We do too, Caleb said. And he did. He had a feeling the old fella was right. The clues made sense. They'd started back at the library, researching the waterways in the 1700s. Numerous minor rivers crisscrossed the state that had since dried up and were overgrown. Of course, topography had changed over time, which would explain why a ship floating downriver could have run aground. Likely, Luis Alejandro Ruiz had a guide and sailors helping him navigate. Through reading, they guessed that he buried the ship with its treasure because he didn't want anyone to find it and intended to go back for the bounty. Likely, that was never to be. What convinced Caleb the treasure was still out there was the lead poisoning. He imagined the ship was nearby one of the waterways that fed the creek where Gus fished and had leached heavy metals into the water. If they found the ship, not only would they solve a historical mystery, they'd also help the environment. Caleb and Cleo had a few more days with the rental on Mansion Mile, and they were determined to locate the Floribel before they each returned to New York City, packed up their lives, and then started house hunting in Blue Bay Beach. I like the cottage on Pelican Lane, Cleo said as they walked side by side parallel to the creek. It's a bit small, especially if we have 10 kids, Caleb said. There's a rental available on Egret Avenue until you figure things out. Offer stands, Betty called. Tucker stayed there before he and Chevy got married. Nice little place. Speaking of weddings, my mother is already sending me email links to theme ideas, dresses, and vendors. Cleo shook her head. I don't think I want another big to-do. I had a wild idea, Caleb said. Wilder than scouring the marshlands of South Florida looking for a ship that was believed to have sunk in the waters off the coast on the other side of the state? What if we did a destination wedding? Caleb asked. Cleo stopped in her tracks. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? The Dominican Republic, they both said at the same time. Cleo started jumping up and down when a loud beeping sounded from nearby. I have a live one, Gus called. Betty hovered her metal detector close to where her husband stood. It beeped. Cleo and Caleb hurried over and did the same. The beeping was like a cacophony of crazy cicadas. The four of them looked from one to the other. Backing up, they spread the perimeter wider, and the beeping continued. How'd we miss this before? Betty asked. We never came quite this far inland, Gus said. I suppose you're right. I haven't been on these trails since I was a youngster. Soon, they were several yards apart, forming a rough rectangle. Gus had neon marker ribbon and cordoned off the space. Cleo captured the coordinates with her phone. They had supplies for light digging but would have to go back with machinery. Good thing I own this property, Betty said. We'd need to get the state or landholders involved, and that can get messy. She added. You can thank my daddy for giving me lead poisoning, Gus grumbled. Betty giggled. He wanted to make sure you treated me right. But you can't blame him for a ship buried on his land that he didn't know about. Have I done okay treating you right, dear? Gus asked his wife. More than okay. The couple gave each other a peck on the cheek. Cleo cooed. Let's be like that. Caleb kissed her cheek. Definitely. Okay, love birds. We have to get Tucker and the boys in here with the swamp logger, Gus said. Speaking of love birds, a little birdie reported chirps about a wedding in the Dominican Republic. Betty waggled her eyebrows. It's an idea, Cleo said. She barely hid the excitement from her voice. We'd both like a small, intimate, meaningful occasion. We've both already survived big, fussy weddings. It's your day. You do it your way, Betty said with an air of approval. Just have Betty tell you about our wedding day, Gus said with a laugh. It's a story for the ages. After returning to town, they got a hold of Tucker and a few others who knew how to operate heavy machinery and headed back to the marshland. They had to be careful of alligators and snakes, which was probably a reason the ship had never been recovered. Cleo and Caleb walked beside Betty. You said your father left you this property and you own a few houses in town. Anything we should know about Florida homeownership? Oh, loads. But as far as Blue Bay Beach goes, it's believed to be a place glittering with gold for those who know how to look for treasure. She winked. That's what it said on the founding father, Hernando Olivar's, plaque, Caleb said. That's right. My daddy made sure I had it memorized. You see, my maiden name is Olivar. You're a descendant of Hernando? Cleo asked. Sure am. There's a lot that's special about our town. I'm glad I get to share it with you. I hope my mother likes it here. She confessed that she's lonely, Cleo said. Oh, we'll welcome her with some key lime coconut cream pie and make sure she falls in love too. Betty winked. They reached the place where the metal detectors had gone bananas. Tucker operated the swamp logger, using the hoe attachment, and started to remove the earth from the area. It was slow going, but Cleo wanted to document and no one wanted to miss it if they discovered the ship. The mosquitoes were fierce as the sun started to lower in the sky. They still had plenty more daylight, but everyone was as jittery as the flying insects with each pull of mud from the earth. All at once, the machine went still, quiet. Tucker hopped down from the cockpit. Wearing waders, he trudged into the midst of where he'd been digging. Dressed the same, the others followed with metal detectors and shovels. Wait, Tucker called. The wood of the ship probably rotted. There could be sinkholes. Everyone, use caution. Betty's device beeped loudly, and they proceeded to dig. It was grueling, sweaty work, but sure enough, they found a metal chain and an enormous anchor. Everyone cheered loud enough to be heard back in town. There's probably a proper way to do this, but I can't resist. The Florabelle is down there and we're going to find that treasure. Betty whooped. Isley, Ford, Carter, Claudia, Billy, Rhodes, Chevy, Ruby, Trent, and young Caleb chipped in. Just before dusk, they'd cleared the area to reveal the skeleton of the ship. In what would have been its cargo hold, they excavated vast amounts of mud-covered gold, silver, jewels, crowns, candelabras, and all manner of treasure. Cleo filmed while they carefully removed and catalogued it all. Tucker had gone back to town for floodlights, enlisting more help. Soon, half of Blue Bay Beach was watching like it was a spectator event. And it was. It was amazing that there was treasure hiding in what was essentially Betty and Gus's backyard. But really, the community in Blue Bay Beach were the real gems. People brought cold beverages, snacks, and bug spray. Others brought sparklers and music. It turned into a party. She found Caleb, sweating and covered in muck. She gave him a side hug, also covered in sweat and dirt. I feel like this is in part to celebrate Louise and Isabel. Even though they were never able to be together, they brought us together. All of us, she said. Caleb smiled and his electric blue eyes crinkled before he kissed her softly on the lips. I think you're right. They'd solved the mystery of the Florabelle. The news covered it and Betty ensured that they took care of everything properly for historical preservation. It was like she'd been preparing for just such a discovery in that little library of hers. Betty and Gus gave Cleo and Caleb each a generous portion of the proceeds. Caleb gave his portion to young Caleb to invest in his business and Cleo was reinvesting hers in the town. She was adding a brick and mortar component to Cana Market and enlisting her mother's help to run the place. A few days later, after dinner at Coconut Cove with everyone, Cleo and Caleb headed back to the rental on Mansion Mile. They paused in front of the vacant shop she was going to rent. Caleb rested his hand on her low back. You mentioned that you were afraid to fail in your business. I'm proud of you for going for it. I have to admit that part of me is a bit afraid to fail in this relationship. Being a doctor has a lot of variables, but there are also set protocols. Do X and Y should follow. If you're faced with Z, you open up the physician's desk reference. Relationships don't come with a PDR, but I'd say you've already succeeded. Cleo gazed into Caleb's eyes and then beyond to his office space above what would be Cana Market. I'm proud of you for continuing to follow your calling with a slight modification. The signs for their respective businesses were already hung. Cana Market on the bottom and Robinson Family Medicine up top. With the addition of a banner that said coming soon. When they got back to the house, Caleb smoothed his hand over the wristband of his watch and then took it off. It's time to let this go. He set it on the counter. Cleo kissed him on the cheek, lighting him up. Now that we found the treasure, we have to plan our next adventure. And what's that? Caleb returned the kiss. Planning our wedding in the doctor. She kissed him on the other cheek. And about our honeymoon. Remember the adventures we were going to take where we'd kiss in every country? Caleb kissed her other cheek too. I like the way you're thinking, Cleo said, finally settling on his lips. I love you, Cleo, Caleb said, returning the kiss. She returned the sentiment and sealed it with a kiss that stretched leagues and miles and lifetimes. I love you too, she said.